The Aliope Empire, the greatest power on the continent, was blessed with sacred beasts. Divine creations bestowed from above were the embodiment of the will of the gods. The people of the empire looked with awe upon the 4 powerful ducal houses that owned these wondrous creatures, considering them living gods. But after half a millennium of prosperity since the founding of the empire, the house of Manhwa, for some unknown reason, incurred the wrath of the sacred beast. He left his masters, dissolving into nothingness. Duke Manhwa, having accepted the full weight of his guilt, agreed to be imprisoned in a high tower. His young son, Evander Manhwa, became the new duke. With the loss of the sacred beast, the influence of the house of Manhwa inexorably faded. The voices calling for them to be deprived of their former greatness grew louder and louder. People said, how can a family deprived of divine protection be called ducal? And they called for only 3 ducal houses to be left, not 4. But the emperor, filled with sympathy for the young Evander, came forward with his own proposal. He offered him to perform an ancient summoning ritual to obtain a new sacred beast. On the appointed day, the great mystery took place, but there were also doubters. So, someone asked if this was not fraught with immeasurable danger. After all, calling on an ancient creature could clearly lead to unforeseen consequences. However, in response, it was noted that they had no choice. The imperial will was unyielding. Nevertheless, there was a risk of awakening something completely unimaginable, and the hearts of many in the room sank with fear. The priest asked if the young master was ready to begin the summoning. He answered in the affirmative, declaring that the shame he had borne until today must be washed away. Evander was determined to take advantage of this last chance, which had been granted to him solely by the grace of the emperor. And whatever monster emerged from this circle, he was ready to subjugate it to his will and make it a new divine beast of his kind in order to return to its former greatness. He gave the order to his soldiers to get ready. Fear ran cold in everyone's veins, but it had to be done. After the monk's staff struck the ground, the duke shouted for the ancient creature to appear. With the second blow, the cry was repeated again. Waves of magic trembled around those in the hall, enveloping them and causing delight and horror at the same time. The young duke stood ready, his nerves strained to the limit. Now he was either doomed or lost. He suddenly felt an unprecedented strength that filled his entire being and wondered how powerful this creature must be, whether he would be able to tame it. But after the loud explosions and streams of magic, something unimaginable suddenly appeared before his eyes. Some little baby with a loud squeak, peep peep, very tiny and small, appeared in front of the soldiers and monks. The duke looked at him and could not believe that everything had really ended in failure. The knights were taken aback but did not dare to say a word, so surprised and disappointed were they. The little creature, even if it was an ancient being, was much smaller than the duke expected, and even cute. However, Evander took up his sword again, remembering that he must not let his guard down. Such creatures can be very strong. He expected that behind the cute creature's mask there might be a powerful force, but the baby sat and watched, continuing to squeal. And suddenly he grabbed his head, not understanding what was happening around him. The baby suddenly thought that he was still sleeping, because just a moment ago he felt the warmth emanating from his mother. The creature thought to itself that Asura, as it called itself in the third person, simply had not woken up yet. She pinched her cheeks, then even bit her tail to try to wake up. The duke and his companions looked puzzled, not understanding what this little beast was doing. And he suddenly lay down on his side and curled up into a small ball. He was very scared and uncomfortable. Swords were reflected in her pink eyes, tears were flowing from her eyes, and Asura even felt pain, although no one touched her. She suddenly realized that this was not a dream, and that she was no longer at home, in her beautiful, fairy tale-like life, but in some cold and alien place. When she squealed loudly, those around her decided that she was uttering a battle cry and grabbed their swords tighter. The duke ordered preparations for battle and demanded that calm be maintained so that his knights would not panic. Asura's eyes widened and she wondered why she couldn't feel the animal power emanating from them. It was strange. It seemed they weren't like her. Then she decided that these were not beastmen who had taken human form, but real people. She was amazed, because in her world there were no such people and she had never met them. There were rumors among the beastmen about humans, demonic creatures that could devour them with a single bite, but thanks to her unusual mother, Asura knew the truth. She often repeated to her that Asura would become the summoned one, the main hero of another world. Her mother said that there was one boy who was destroying their faith in people, and Asura was just an extra whom he would call upon and destroy. The mother was saddened. She felt sorry that her daughter was just a minor character in a tragic play. However, the little girl did not understand what was being discussed, but her mother immediately told her not to despair. Even if she's just a minor character, she has a chance to survive if she does everything right. To do this, she had to listen to her mother's advice, and then she would be able to change her destiny, rewrite the outcome of events. The mother was sure that the human boy had a dark past, full of suffering. Asel should hug him, warm him with her warmth, and he would stand on her side. Then he will see her as a friend, not an enemy. Then Asel must reconcile him with his father. They have a difficult, strained relationship. And then, if she does everything right, the boy will want to call her wife, and his dad will want her to call him father. But Mom said that Asel was a creature of a different species, so under no circumstances should she agree to the marriage. She must politely convey his love to the human protagonist. The mother really hoped that she understood every word she said to her, but Asel realized that she should have listened to her mother more carefully. But there were two things that were imprinted in her memory forever, because she is smart. She remembered that the human boy was her husband, and the boy's father was her father. While Evander was screaming at her to give up, calling her a monster, she thought it was her husband. The guards stood there in confusion, not knowing whether to attack because the monster looked so pitiful. Asel tried to tell them something but realized that they did not understand her. She took out her white handkerchief to wipe herself and blow her nose, but one thought came into her head. In kindergarten, she was taught that even if she didn't speak the language of the people, she could still get her intentions across. The teacher said that when meeting people, you need to wave a white handkerchief at them to show that you do not intend to attack and that you come in peace. He made her repeat these words, so Asel immediately decided to act before she got hurt. She took off the white scarf from her neck and began waving it desperately. Asel whined and squealed, trying to convey that she was giving up. The men stood there, not understanding what was happening. They thought it was a ritual dance. The boy shouted again for the knights to be on guard and not to let down their guard. He felt that something huge and terrible was about to fly out at him. Everyone stood frozen, but the animal stubbornly waved its white handkerchief and squealed. It was hard to imagine that it was trying to harm them, although they had never seen anything like it before. Asel did not lose hope and continued waving her handkerchief to convey her thoughts. Finally, one of those present realized that she was waving a white flag and decided that it was a sign of surrender. Looking closer, he noticed that there was still a fragment of an eggshell on the top of her head. The monster was very tiny, still a baby. Evander thought that perhaps she understood their speech, but how could they communicate with her? The baby was tired and her strength was gone. She no longer waved and just sat there, squeaking. Here, the Duke handed her his white handkerchief on his sword. After that, he told her to stop crying. She was understood. The little girl looked and couldn't believe it. He really wanted to give her a handkerchief. She took it in her hands, blew her nose loudly, and noticed that it smelled very good. He turned to the monk and asked if it was possible to cast a translation spell on this creature, receiving a positive answer. The monk waved his staff, and communication with the monster became possible. However, the baby kept squeaking, and the boy did not understand what he was trying to say. Meanwhile, the monk noticed that everything was obvious. He was simply begging for mercy. Looking at him, Evander again wondered if such a tiny thing could become a divine beast. At this moment, the monk tried to attract the Duke's attention. The translation spell worked, and the first thing Evander heard was the baby saying that she didn't taste good. Raising her pitiful eyes, filled with tears, she looked with hope at the one she was about to call her husband. She begged him not to eat her, and that was the most she could do, although it became clear that she was calling the Duke her husband. Upon returning to the castle, the Duke's servant noticed that his abilities were not sufficient to adequately perform the functions of a divine beast. The Duke's interlocutor suggested that it would be worthwhile to request permission for a second call from the Emperor. In response, Evander said that they did not have enough funds for this. They most likely won't be allowed to perform the ritual again. They'll have to make do with what they have. The interlocutor resisted and tried to prove that with such a divine beast, they would not be able to return to their former greatness. The Duke picked up the baby in his arms and she began to squeal again. After that, he stated that everything would be decided after they found out what she was capable of. They approached the hall, which was closed by heavy doors. This was the habitat of the former divine beast of the clan. Carefully lifting the baby by the armpits, Evander wondered what to do next. At this time, Asel thought that they were going to roast him and eat him. She addressed him as her husband, to which the Duke replied that he should be called Master, and if she did not like it, she could call him by his first name. He introduced himself as Evander. Asel remembered what they said about wild people who could eat beastmen. Since he said his name, it means he's not going to eat her right now. However, she decided to also give her name and said that her name was Asura. After this, the Duke asked what she could do. He asked if she could destroy a castle with a spell or heal wounds. She may be able to see the future. The little girl shook her head desperately, showing that this was not so. She was still sure that she could be eaten, and again asked him not to do it, calling him her husband. The Duke put his fist on the table and asked what she could do. In response, he heard something rather strange and not at all promising. She said that she was good at climbing trees. She is also an excellent swimmer. It seemed like everything was very bad. It looked like a complete failure. The little girl persistently tried to explain that she did not want to become a fried dragon. She added that she sang well and again said that she was not tasty, so that he should not eat her, and again called him her husband. As a result, he expressed disappointment and said that he was not her husband. The little girl was frightened. She realized that her chances were getting smaller, and upset, she folded her paws and cried again. At this moment, there was a knock on the door and an announcement that food had been brought, as the Duke had requested. He ordered the servants to enter, after which he remembered that he had given orders in advance regarding food, in case the hungry monster suddenly became uncontrollable. At that moment, a servant entered with a tray. However, as soon as he lifted the lid, Asura was horrified. She screamed loudly because a living creature was brought to her. It was rabbit, generously sprinkled with various spices and surrounded by vegetables. Seeing the monster's indignation, the Duke asked if it was really too small for him, and that if he wasn't full, they could bring him more. After this, he added that he was not going to take food away from the monster, and he could eat. However, the little girl said that the bunny friend was not food, and the Duke was surprised. She realized that people were truly dangerous creatures and that she needed to run away immediately. Asura immediately jumped off the table. The Duke noticed that it was dangerous, but she no longer listened to him. She decided that she could return home if she left the room with the barrier. So she boldly and decisively headed towards the door. She just needed to get out of the room. Then she could use the spell to return to the Beastman world. The handle was too high. She couldn't fly yet, but she tried to open the door with her own strength. At this time, the Duke watched in bewilderment at what the monster was doing. One of his interlocutors said that he was too cute to be a divine beast. The Duke approached her and called her name, but she only looked back in response. Asura thought that she needed to get out of here immediately before he grabbed her. She needed to return to the forest, to her mother. She used all her strength to push the door, but it didn't take much effort. She was immediately thrown back by the flame that burst out of her mouth at the wrong time. She felt awkward. She thought that now she would definitely be roasted for trashing everything around her. The people around stood and wondered if this little monster had really destroyed the orichalcum doors. It was impossible, and no one could do it. The Duke headed towards her, but he was already beginning to fear the situation. He asked if the monster had just breathed out fire. At that moment, the little girl was very scared, didn't know what to do, and didn't want to answer. Now she's definitely in danger of turning into a barbecue dragon. At this time, guards approached them, asking what was happening in the middle of the night. They couldn't believe that the little monster could break through such strong doors, and wondered how much strength he really had. However, it was decided that until the renovation of this room, which was planned to be given to her, was completed, she would be located in another room. The little girl sat on the floor, completely upset, hugging the little bunny. She thought that everything wasn't so bad, at least she hadn't been fried, and her bunny friend was still alive. Asura still couldn't understand why everyone was so scared, and because of them, she herself was scared. Perhaps they were afraid of her because she was a strong dragon. However, she noticed that the mana density in the human world was too weak, and under this state of affairs, she would soon be unable to cast the return spell. Until her mother comes to pick her up, she just needs to survive and not become someone's food, after which she began to search her secret space for what she needed. Throwing away the unnecessary toys that came at her call, she tried to find the thing she needed. It was good that she could simply reach all her things by reaching through the small portal. She finally found what she was looking for, a book she had taken from the library with her mother, which described how to survive when meeting a person. As long as she had this book, she was sure that she would never be eaten. The book said that you shouldn't fight with people. You need to inform the adult beastmen about them. But there were no adult beastmen in the human world. The book went on to say that you had to wave a white handkerchief to show that you didn't intend to fight. She had already tried that. The book stated that people are cowards, strong in front of the weak, cruel towards them, and able to exploit vulnerabilities. Even if she fails to put up a defense, she should never be afraid, but instead act fiercely so that people do not look down on the children of the beastmen. The little girl really liked this last point, and she decided to do just that. She shouted loudly that she was now a fierce dragon. Asel made the most ferocious face, even the bunny got scared. Then she practiced looking menacing some more, because she really liked it. The bunny was tired of boredom and decided to rest a little while the dragon was having fun. At this moment, new characters appeared in the hall. One man asked menacingly why he had not been informed earlier, and was told that the Duke had ordered it to be kept secret until the situation had calmed down. Soon they approached the room where Asel was, and the man asked if this monster was dangerous. The little girl, happily tired after long images of the wild dragon, watched the two men. She thought that one of them was the assistant she saw yesterday with her husband. She didn't know who the second one was, but just in case she waved her tail to wake up the bunny in case there was danger ahead. At that moment, the grown man suddenly spoke and called her a creature. Then he asked if they considered him dangerous. Asel thought that this old man looked like her husband. If so, then he was her father. However, apparently he did not like this suggestion. He asked sharply what exactly the dragon had said, and she replied that she was too small and had almost no meat. After this, she added that even if he ate her, he would still remain hungry, and called him father. The man wondered why he was her father. He had never had a daughter-in-law like her. The little girl didn't know what to answer him. He watched her settle into the crib and couldn't believe that it could be a monster. However, Asel thought that he should be her husband's father, and was surprised why he did not allow her to call him father. At that moment, the Duke appeared in the room, asking forgiveness for not having met his grandfather at the gate, and remarking that if he had sent at least a message, he would have come out to greet him. The man turned around and told the Duke not to worry. He had lived a long life, but this was the first time he had heard something so absurd. The Duke was not obliged to meet his subjects. And he asked why this little girl thought that she was his grandson's stepmother. The young Duke Evenler, not understanding what was being said, asked again. The little girl thought that she was not a stepmother and felt that something was wrong with the situation. She looked at this man and remembered how her mother said that she needed to be careful with this man. It was Elkai Munrepe, the protagonist's grandfather and the previous Duke. In the original, this grandfather did not like the little dragon, especially because she looked like a wyvern. This grandfather suffered from some unknown disease, which only worsened his condition and made his disposition even worse. The little girl looked at her grandfather and thought that he looked well, despite the fact that her mother said that he was sick. At that moment, Lord Elkai turned to her and asked what she could do, what superpowers she had. He asked if she had great power, if she was able to control magic. The little girl said again that she can climb trees and swim well, and also sings well. There were people standing around, and she realized that the matter seemed very serious again. However, she decided to try to convince this man by talking about her merits and how wonderful she was. Asel was sure that she had convinced him, although he looked at her coldly and emotionlessly. He said he didn't know why she was lying, but the Duke intervened. The little girl indignantly said that she had not lied, but Evander decided to tell his grandfather everything himself. He reported that she was breathing fire yesterday. The little girl was very surprised that there were dragons that could not breathe fire, although this only happened once when she breathed out flame. Asel herself couldn't believe that she had succeeded because she was too scared. However, when the Duke added that she had destroyed the orichalcum doors with this fire, the grandfather was surprised. The little girl was outraged that her husband had snitched and decided that they would definitely be turned into grilled meat now. The man thought for a moment and made some strange whining sounds that seemed to express doubt. He said that the dragon might look like a pathetic little bug, but it was worth checking and confirming. The little girl was outraged at being called a little bugger and believed that no one dared to treat the great dragon like that. She expressed her anger by stamping her foot because such an insult was unacceptable towards the beastmen, who were famous for their strength. She began to breathe menacingly, looking at them as if preparing for a fight. Asel decided it was time to demonstrate the ferocity she had trained for so long, but the man asked why the little bugger was making so much noise. She was called a booger again, and she felt very upset. She thought that her grandfather was underestimating her and that he needed to be taught a lesson. She imagined herself grabbing him and tears streaming from his eyes. Asel thought about the fairy tale black dragon she had read about and decided to kidnap her grandfather to teach him a lesson. After this, he will never dare call her a little brat again and will beg for mercy. Asel began to plan an operation to kidnap her grandfather, and a bunny was assigned to help. He turned out to be a very smart and competent assistant who shared her anger. The little girl went down the corridor in search of the room where her grandfather was. Her first step is gathering information. She needed to follow her grandfather and find out his daily routine. She noticed 2 men who were saying that Lord Elkai called her a pathetic little brat. This offended her greatly, and her determination increased. The bunny tried to stop Asil, but she shouted at him indignantly. She was sure she couldn't allow anyone to treat a real dragon like that. The men then discussed that if the Lord asked her to bring him fresh strawberries, then perhaps he did not hate her so much, since strawberries were expensive. Asil heard this and was surprised that he had really prepared strawberries for her. After all, the one they ate last time simply melted in their mouths. Could there really be anything tastier? She couldn't believe it, but she immediately shook her head harshly. At the moment, strawberries were not the main thing. She had her own plan, but thoughts about berries still wouldn't leave her head. She wrote down her plans for punishing her grandfather in a notebook, and together with her bunny friend, she combed every room of the estate day after day. Asil hadn't been everywhere yet, but she needed to understand how life was organized in this house. She continued to observe to identify possible paths her grandfather might take. When she had collected enough information, she slammed the notebook shut with satisfaction. At that moment, the maid began to clean the room, and Asil thought that all that remained was to wait for the right moment and strike. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, but her diary was lost, and the little girl fell to the floor and cried with grief because everything was lost. At this moment, the servant turned to the Duke. He showed a small notebook on a tray and said that one of the maids had found it during the morning cleaning. The servant remarked that, judging by its size, the notebook must have belonged to Lady Asil. The Duke took it in his hands and asked where it was found. The maid explained that it was in the corridor of the western living room during cleaning. She assumed this because the notebook was lying right opposite Asil's room, and the Duke thought it would be wise to take a peek there. The diary was difficult to understand, but it was clear that its owner had wandered around the estate quite a lot. The notebook contained various caricatures, executed unevenly and clumsily, but the Duke noticed that all the drawings, despite this, were full of cheerfulness. He smiled, satisfied with this, and thought that Asil had settled into the estate, which made him very happy. Inside, he was worried that the baby might not get used to this place. In the evening, a thunderstorm began. Lightning flashed and split the sky. Asil thought that the operation to kidnap her grandfather with her participation had completely failed. She couldn't understand how she lost the notebook. The Duke, approaching her room, noted that the little girl looked depressed, perhaps because of the rain. But Asil remembered that her grandfather had invited them to dinner, and she might be able to get more information. Besides, fresh strawberries couldn't help but please the little dragon. Seeing her cheerful look, the Duke decided that perhaps he had been too worried. She looked cheerful, but he didn't know her real reasons. The bright, sweet strawberries were reflected in her eyes. The Duke could tell from her exclamations that this little girl loved tasty food. She was so happy that she seemed ready to faint with joy. The Lord looked at her and thought that everything was going as he had expected. But every time she looked at her, she still looked like a pathetic little bug, which made Asil indignant. She screamed again that she shouldn't be called that, and the Lord remarked that such topics shouldn't be discussed at the dinner table. The little girl thought that he himself started talking about boogers first. Lord Elkai called her insolent and asked her to explain whether he had any good reason to keep such a creature near him. The Duke noted that she did not usually behave so boldly and suggested that the rainy weather could be the reason. He carefully ignored the fact that Asil was irritated by his grandfather's words and said that he wanted to think everything through carefully. Evander asked for some time, and his grandfather remarked that he very much hoped the Duke knew what he was doing. The grandson promised that he would not disappoint him, but his grandfather's gaze remained menacing. At that moment, Asil was enjoying delicious sweets. She even started drooling with pleasure, and the Lord wondered if Asil was really being tipped for the role of the divine beast. He wondered if their race had become so impoverished that they would never regain their former glory. Although he couldn't help but notice that the baby was eating with an enviable appetite. If she continues like this, her cheeks might burst. But fortunately, he didn't say it out loud, otherwise Asil might have gotten angry again. The grandson remarked that his grandfather had probably missed his walk in the garden because of the rain today and was planning to go tomorrow. Lord Elkai said that before winter he needed to properly enjoy the autumn air. In his condition, it was necessary. Asil realized that her plan might not have failed entirely. The Duke expressed a desire to go with his grandfather, but the latter remarked that this was not necessary, as he had heard that his grandson was already working late. He at least needed to get some sleep, and Evander meekly agreed. Asel thought that perhaps her grandfather only went for walks early in the morning, which gave her a new chance. She noted that her detective skills were simply amazing, and tomorrow in the garden she would have an excellent opportunity to take revenge. There was only the second step left: wait for the right moment and kidnap him. To do this, the little girl hid in the bushes, waiting for her grandfather to appear. Quite a long time passed, a whole 10 days. Lord Elke, as usual, was walking in the garden early in the morning. A servant reported that he looked well, but received the answer that this was hardly true. He still couldn't calm down and tried to speak, calling Asel a creature. The Lord noted that at first he mistook her for a baby wyvern, but upon closer inspection he saw in her more like a mutated lizard. His interlocutor said that if it was just a small reptile, then there was some meaning to it. Grandfather noticed that when she ate strawberries, she bit off tiny pieces, and her little face, smaller than his palm, chewed in such a funny way. He couldn't help but notice that she was really very funny. Even his grandson always called him Lord, but this little girl calls him Grandpa. He remembered how she said not Dad, but Grandpa. She also has a strange habit of waving the shells on her head, as if she were saving them especially for soup. Lord Elkai suddenly became cheerful and noted that despite everything, she was a very funny little creature. His interlocutor thought that he seemed to have already begun to love him. Perhaps it was because Lord Elkai had spent most of his life in battle, had never been close to his children, and even his only grandson had grown up too quickly. It was obvious that the Lord was not immune to charm, despite the fact that he was, after all, just a lizard. At this point, the grandfather asked if Beyonce had returned yet, and the answer was that he would arrive immediately after completing the task. He chuckled and said that this was complete nonsense. This fool had no sense of priority at all. He should be the eldest in the family, but when the so-called ancient monster awakened, he didn't even show his nose. After that, he said to tell Beyonce to drop everything and come here immediately. At that moment, they heard a scream and saw Asel running towards them. The older man was a little surprised, but she seemed friendly on the outside. She waved her hands joyfully and invited me to come with her for a minute. Lord Elke asked why. She replied that he would find out if he followed her. The servant was shocked and could not understand how the lizard dared to talk to the Lord like that. However, he told the servant to stay here, and he himself went after Asel. He immediately warned her that if she called him without a reason, she would regret it, but she said that it was very important. She hung on his leg to make him go forward on his own, and declared that she would enter the room herself. The servant thought that if he had such a lizard, he would probably spoil her too, because she was extremely cute. At that moment, Asel brought her grandfather to the right place. She opened the doors of the chosen room, trying not to show her delight, but joy was already shining in her eyes. Asel extinguished the fire of victory and closed the doors with her hands, determined to punish him to the fullest extent of her ability and according to her own ideas. At this point, the Lord's second son, shouting indignantly, declared that he did not care that his nephew had summoned some pathetic beast. He thought to himself that he had hoped that this monster would bite Evander to death, but it seemed that it was too weak. He then remarked that if it couldn't become a divine beast, it would be better to just kill it, so why bother with it? Beyonce stated that he was making connections to secure the duchy for himself. The servant replied that it seemed that Evander simply wanted to observe the beast, as the creature had allegedly breathed out a huge flame. The son of Duke Beyonce expressed doubt that this could not be. The servant said that there were also rumors that this flame had broken through the orichalcum doors. The would-be duke noted that this was complete nonsense. Even explosions did not leave scratches on the things these doors were made of, and they could not be taken with bare paws. His servant noted that he also considered this nonsense, but it could not be ignored, since the divine beast's room was currently being renovated. Beyonce said with a grin that it was typical for a child to leave a fortress in ruins. His servant, always ready to flatter, remarked that in fact it was Beyonce who should have become the duke. The gentleman replied irritably that if his father had had even half his insight, that would have happened. Beyonce's older brother Eckhart, no matter how handsome and competent he was, should never have been appointed heir to the duchy. Beyonce should have been appointed duke back then, but in the end this little fellow, his nephew, stole his title. The man's face turned black. He couldn't understand why his father only cared about that family, when he was also his son. He turned sharply and took a big step to the side. Then he noticed that he was told that the monster looked like a wyvern, to which he received confirmation from his servant. He then asked why his father had not drawn his sword against him. A man who had dedicated his life to hunting wyverns should surely have been enraged at the mere mention of them. However, the servant said that there were rumors that the Lord kept him with him at all times. Biante noted that this was as expected. He said that Lord Elkai must be waiting for the right moment to kill him. He is a ruthless man. But the servant said that the matter was completely different. They say that he simply adores him. Biante couldn't believe it and asked if a man who never said a kind word to his children, let alone his grandchildren, could really care about anyone. The servant was confused in his testimony because hadn't he just said that the Lord didn't plan to make him a divine beast? However, the servant said that there were some circumstances that needed to be taken into account. Biante exploded and said that of course he plans to. Why else would he adore him? The cunning servant remarked that if this animal became a divine beast, it could be their opportunity. After all, if the Lord's sacred beast killed him, they could undermine the Duke's position on the grounds that he had chosen such an insignificant creature as a deity. Biante noted that he could then be accused of killing a divine beast. The servant apologized and said that he had not thought it through that far. However, another thought entered the Duke's son's head. If they killed the lizard before it was declared a divine beast, there would be no problem. The servant had not thought of such a possibility. He was surprised out loud at his master's insight. Biante ordered him to send word that he himself was delayed, so he would send his divine beast first. The servant began to understand his master's insidious plan. When his divine beast arrives at the castle, just like last time, something irreparable will happen. That big bear did a lot of damage back then. Biante said that everything was correct. The servant should stage his escape. Let it seem that the bear had broken free. It was necessary to direct him to the lizard's favorite path. The servant asked what would happen if the Duke, after losing this creature, suddenly called for another. His master replied that he hardly had that much money, and he was right. Sipping the wine he loved to quench his thirst with, Biante thought his plan was quite good. He noted that once the creature died, there would be no evidence of its involvement. At this point, the grandfather indignantly asked if the little girl had really called an adult for such a useless purpose. However, his hands were already tied, and Asil said that she would show him something. He sat tied up on the floor, and Asil sighed with satisfaction. She decided to show him her terrible appearance. As he unwound the ropes, the Duke asked why she had tied him so tightly, but she screamed at him not to untie himself. Looking pleadingly into his eyes, she explained that she had tried very hard. Asil was outraged by his behavior. As a prisoner, he did not show any respect to her, and went to discuss what happened with the rabbit. Grandfather looked and could not understand what they were whispering about. At that moment, both of them climbed onto their grandfather's lap, although he tried to look indignant. Lord Elkai told them to go down, but Asil was not happy. He noted that there were plenty of other places to sit, but the little girl declared that this was her place. When Grandpa touched Asil's tail, he thought it was so soft, he expected it to be covered in scales and hard to the touch. So soft that it couldn't be compared to the skin of a wyvern, the little girl at that moment tried to demand that her grandfather sit still. He looked at her and suddenly began to understand that he could forgive her everything in the world. She has such a clear voice, she probably sings very well. Then I thought it would be interesting to see her play with the ball with her short paws. He remembered her saying that she was good at climbing trees, and that perhaps she could gather some acorns for him. Looking at her with a tenderness he had never felt before, he stroked her little head. Asil thought that finally her grandfather was not moving, and now she would show him. She came down, lay down on the ground, and tried to look as fierce as possible. At that moment, the maid came in and said that it was time for young Mrs. Asil to have a snack. Lord Elkai felt disappointed because he had started to enjoy the game, but the little girl had completely switched over to strawberries. She turned to him and offered her grandfather something to eat, although she herself wanted to eat it as quickly as possible. But Asil remembered how the teacher said that adults should eat first, and turning to the rabbit, she said that children eat later. Lord Elkai said he would try a little and added that they should eat quickly. As Asil nibbled on the strawberry little by little, she thought that her grandfather had eaten the whole berry in just one bite. Lord Elkai did not like this berry, but admitted that it was now quite edible and did not notice how, following one berry, he sent all the others into his mouth. Meanwhile, the basket was completely empty. This really upset the little girl. She wanted to give him a treat, but he didn't leave her anything. And her plan to kidnap didn't work. The strawberries ran out. She was completely upset and wanted to be alone. As she walked down the hallway, she thought that she had kidnapped her grandfather in vain, and that she had a very small mouth, so she could not eat quickly. and because of this, she was unable to show her fierce and terrible dragon form. At that moment, she heard a conversation about an upcoming disaster. Lord Bionte's sacred bear beast was about to arrive soon. He was already breaking out, and then everyone almost got into great danger. Asil did not understand what kind of bear they were talking about and who Bionte was. One of the maids remarked that the Duke could simply forbid Bionte from entering the castle, to which another replied that this would be very difficult, since it was impossible to impose restrictions on sacred animals in the Empire. The girls decided that they would have to be careful for now, and Asil wondered if bears were really that scary. Then she decided that if she taught a lesson to a bear that people were afraid of, she would be considered an even more terrible creature than the bear. It was a completely feasible and new plan that could finally make her a fierce and terrible dragoness. A few days later, the sacred beast bear arrived at the castle. Sitting at tea with Asil, the Duke noticed that the bear was now sleeping and seemed calm, but it was better to be careful. Therefore, she had to walk with the guard knight for now. The little girl thought that she could handle him alone and became offended, deciding that her husband considered her a small child. At that moment, someone entered the room. He introduced himself and said that he was a guard knight who would be escorting the young lady Asil, and asked to be called Dylan. The Duke said he was just in time. Asil thought that the guard didn't need to be here. He was superfluous. She introduced herself to him by name so that he would not call her a sacred beast, and remarked that she could take care of him. The little girl looked at him and wondered if it was to her advantage to have a witness. Most likely, yes, because then he will be able to tell everyone that the young lady Asil defeated the bear and dealt with him very ferociously. He will spread rumors around the area and everyone will know that Asil is a terribly scary dragon. The little girl liked this idea and decided not to object to the knight. However, she noticed that he was actually shaking. Dylan thought to himself that he had been appointed as the reptile's guard knight. He had been injured by a lizard bite as a child, and now he had to guard her. It had to happen like that. But he was a knight, and not a bad one. But if he is fired, he can be kicked out of the family. So he simply stated that he would be there all the time and would help if needed, mentally trying to overcome his fear. He decided to remain calm and overcome his trauma. He had no other choice. And Asil decided that since he needed to play the role of a witness, she needed to become friends with him. The knight turned and walked away, and she followed him. He asked where she was going. Asil replied that he should not pay attention to her. She decided that she could train with the knight, but the consequences were dire. Dylan was shocked when he saw her destroy the training ground. She did it easily, playfully, without realizing that she was destroying everything. It was clear that she was enjoying it, but the scale of destruction was incredible. Dylan couldn't believe that such a little girl could do all this. She repeated all his movements, including kicks. The knights who approached began to ask who had caused the destruction on the training ground and how they could train now. Dylan was confused when he was told that the one he was guarding was a real troublemaker. He replied in confusion that he didn't understand why she continued to break logs. One of the knights took a toy from his bosom and offered to let Asil try it, since his cat was crazy about it. He said she just needed to wave it. Dylan thanked him but wasn't sure it would work. Oddly enough, this funny thing captivated Asil. She jumped after her, trying to catch her, like a little kitten. The game had been going on for quite a while, and Dylan's arm was already hurting. He was already simply holding the stick in his hand, and Asil was playing on her own. She finally managed to take it away, which brought the little girl into wild delight. Asil said that she should give Dylan something valuable for making her happy. In search, she reached into her bins and found what she was looking for. She held out a small, shiny gold coin to him on her paw and offered to take it. She said with seriousness that she was grateful for the help, asking him to spend it wisely. He thanked her, noticing that the coin depicted baby beastmen. Asil decided that since she had shared something valuable with him, they had now become much closer. In this regard, she decided that the time had come to punish her bear friend, because she had a reliable witness who was now on her side. She said that she needed to go somewhere else, inviting the knight to follow her. Dylan was confused and didn't understand why he had such a change in mood, but since he was assigned to guard her, he could not refuse. He tried in vain to find out what her plan was, since he was a guard knight and had to know. Asil sniffed and smelled the bear, but did not reveal her intentions. She was glad of such luck, because she did not expect that finding him would be so easy. At that moment, it was as if a maddened divine beast rushed at them. Dylan couldn't tell when he had managed to free himself, but he immediately grabbed his sword. The knight shouted for the young lady Asil to stand behind him, realizing that this was his first task received from the Duke. He will definitely protect his divine beast no matter what. The bear waved his paw, but the little girl was afraid that he would harm her guard. She screamed that Asura would save Dylan and rushed to attack. It looked quite comical, a small lump against a huge bear. The outcome of the fight seemed obvious. Dylan was confused because he didn't know how to get her out of the clutches of this beast now. There was a cracking sound and the walls broke. At that moment he saw little Mrs. Asura pounce on the bear. He lay there, defeated. It was incredible. Asura, looking at him, asked if he saw how strong she was and how she coped. Dylan was amazed. He didn't expect that such a thing was even possible, and when he told about it, no one believed him. However, everyone saw that the little girl was sitting on the fallen large animal. The Duke asked if she had really dealt with the bear alone. She lowered her eyes modestly and made her signature pie sound. The Lord asked if anyone had seen her do it. Dylan replied that he was there and saw with his own eyes how the young lady Asura single-handedly dealt with the sacred beast. He noticed that at that time he was simply under the protection of the lady and considered that he had completely failed and he had nothing to say even if he was fired. The Lord said he had more questions and ordered his servant to find out who opened the bear's cage. Asura said she knew who released the bear. Not long before this, she had talked to the beast and he had told her everything. The bear said that he was just eating meat, and one man told him to stop and started hitting him with a whip. The animal felt ashamed and decided that it would be better to lie down. Asura, according to the bear, described the man as having a beard and slanted eyes. Then she showed his face, pointing to his cheeks. Perhaps this is the vassal serving the Lord's second son. He asked Asura how she knew what he looked like. She replied that she had seen him herself. There was no point in snitching on the bear, you could have lied a little. Dylan asked skeptically if she really meant to say she saw it from that distance. However, Asura did not lose her composure and confirmed that this was exactly how things were. Lord LK gritted his teeth at that moment, showing his displeasure with his second son. He ordered his servant to immediately convey the order to Beyonce to come to him if he wanted to avoid an untimely death. Asura and her guard knight were ordered to follow the Duke. It was necessary to clarify the circumstances of the incident in detail. Dylan was instructed to act without delay. Asura was outraged by the Lord's harsh tone. In her opinion, she had done nothing wrong, so why was he angry with her? On the way, Asura dropped her handkerchief, which the Duke picked up. He remembered that it was he who was on it on the very first day. This little disappearance of the baby gave the Duke the idea of doing something nice for Asura. If she really did take down the sacred bear beast on her own, she deserves better. The Duke felt ready to make a final decision regarding Asura. She appeared so strong that she could become a true divine beast. That same evening, events in the castle did not subside. The Lord attacked Beyonce with accusations of freeing the bear from the cage, who knelt before his father, insisting that there was a misunderstanding. But LK noted that, apparently, the previous incident was also his doing. The Lord declared that he was unworthy of having sacred beasts. He gave his son 3 days to hand them all over to the young Duke Evander. Beyonce objected that this was too harsh a punishment, but the Lord was adamant, saying that there would not be 2 dukes of Munrepe, and Beyonce would be stripped of this title. Afterwards, the guilty second son spoke with his servant. The servant reported that she even gave the bear a special potion to make him more irritable and furious. After this, no one would have been able to defeat the beast. Beyonce asked how strong that knight Dylan was. The servant said that he had previously served in the Imperial Guard, but still would not have been able to overcome the bear. He said that even 10 knights couldn't cope with him in such a state. However, Asura defeated him. Beyonce thought everything didn't go according to plan, but he had a spare. He was already on the edge, and things would only get worse if something wasn't done. His father had driven him into a corner. There was no way out. He was not ready to lose his sacred beasts for the sake of his nephew's glory. He called the maid who asked him to save her husband. The woman fell to her knees before him, begging him not to kill her husband, since he was only following orders when he released the beast. She cried, asking for a chance to save her beloved. Beyonce noted that she had to do everything carefully to avoid getting caught. The woman held his legs with trembling hands and promised to do everything in the best possible way. He said that he would give her a chance to atone for her husband's mistake. She must complete one task. Tears filled her eyes when she learned of the task. In 2 days, he will have lunch with his father. The woman will have to replace the bottle of wine that he gives her. So she must kill the Lord. No one must see this, otherwise she will suffer the same fate as her husband. At this time, Asura was persistently looking for her handkerchief, which she had dropped somewhere. She rummaged through the pillows with a sad look. Tears were rolling down her eyes. She was very upset by the loss. This scarf was given to me by my mother. It was her memory and very dear. At that moment, footsteps were heard at the door. The Duke asked permission to enter, and Asel, crying, gave her consent. He quietly opened the door, trying not to make any sudden movements, sensing her upset. Her eyes were red and he decided she was tired. The Duke said he could leave if she wanted to be alone, but she refused. She preferred to be around him. She liked him. Evander leaned on the sofa and apologized for his late visit, then told Asel that he wanted to ask something. She grabbed the pillow and squealed quietly in anticipation of trouble. The Duke reminded that a month ago she had broken down a strong door with fire. Now she had defeated the sacred beast, the bear, which spoke of her strength. The little girl thought that during this time she had made quite a few mistakes. The Duke noticed that she pretended to be weak when she was summoned. He saw through her. Now she definitely won't escape punishment. Could it be that what he is saying now is a new plan to lull her into a false sense of security and catch her? Asel was a very smart dragon and was not easily fooled, so she said she gave in then. The Duke suddenly smiled his soft smile and thanked her. After this, he extended his hand to her, in which was a small cloth. He said he found what she dropped, and Asel was delighted. It was her favorite handkerchief. The Duke noticed that it was very dirty, and he had something else for her. He found a similar scarf for her, but if she didn't like it, she didn't have to take it. The little girl smiled and said that she liked him, again calling the Duke her husband. She thanked him. Evander looked at her and thought that perhaps he would regret his decision for the rest of his life. At that moment, the little girl put on a headscarf and said that it suited her too. The Duke, looking at the sparkling eyes in which only he was reflected, suddenly felt that he would not regret it even if something went wrong. He clenched his hands and thought that before he would have first carefully tested Asel's strength and then made a decision, but not this time. Evander spoke strange words. Do not cry because the night sky is dark, for there is a blessing of moonlight that illuminates your path. This is how he tried to calm himself, because the entire duchy depended on his decision. After this, he took a step towards Asel and knelt down on one knee. He stated that as the head of the family, he asks Asel to become the new divine beast of this family. Asel asked in bewilderment what a divine beast was. The Duke explained that this is a symbol of the strength of each family. He lives side by side with its head and becomes a universal idol. If she could, Asel would have whistled, but she only made a long pie sound. The Duke asked if it might be too difficult for such a little girl. However, she said that it turns out that this means being the head of the family. That would be so great, and then people wouldn't be able to look down on her, she said. She happily added that she really wanted to become a divine beast. The Duke suddenly exhaled. This conversation was one of the most difficult in his life, and placing his hand on his chest, he promised that he would fulfill any of her wishes. He said he swears by his name. Asel did not fully understand the solemnity of the moment, but she liked this proposal. She touched his sleeve with her small paw and uttered an unexpected phrase. She said, "Then let him marry her." The little girl waited impatiently for what he would say. However, he was amazed by this proposal and asked again. She repeated the request again. Then he asked her, confused, if she really liked him. Asel declared that she did not love her husband, which left him in extreme shock. He asked why she wanted to be with him then. Asel replied that her mother told her so, that the boy who called her was her husband. She said she still doesn't understand why her mother told her to call him that, but she always told the truth. In the world of beastmen, marriage is when beastmen who like each other live together. That's why Asel has 5 dads. The Duke, of course, did not expect this, but he had to make a decision. He thought about it, and then said that he too was facing a marriage of convenience, and he could understand this. His mother died when he was born, so he didn't know her. If he had a loving mother, his father might not have lost the divine beast. Then their family would not have fallen into decline. Everything would have been different. He thought that most likely no one would love him because he had ruined his family by the fact of his birth. Therefore, he believed that the only way to save her was to accept the political marriage proposal from the third princess. Although he dreamed of marrying for love as his parents did, fate decreed otherwise, and he was faced with a marriage of convenience. He said that such a marriage is also a marriage, and he is ready to marry Asel, who was confused and said that this does not mean that she does not like her husband. The Duke looked at her in surprise, waiting for her to say more. Asel said that among all the people she knew, she liked him the most. Evander thought for a moment and asked how many people she knew in general. The little girl hesitated before answering, and the Duke waited expectantly. She counted on her little fingers and finally said the exact number. Asel said that she already knows 10 people and can say with certainty that among them, she likes her husband the most. The Duke was surprised. He didn't know that there were no other people in the beastman's world, but this was even better. He laughed. The laugh was loud and cheerful. She couldn't help but support him and laughed too. Evander said that if she wanted it that way, they would get married. Since the divine beast, the protector of her family, so desires it, he will not resist her. And it doesn't matter that he became the best of 10, that's an achievement in itself. Asel began to ask what marriage meant to them, but the Duke suddenly felt that the weight had lifted from his soul and he became empty. Evander said it was time to go to bed and it would be better to discuss everything another time. After that, he gently stroked her head and smiled a quiet and very tired smile. However, he stopped near the door, realizing that this day would change his whole life, both as the head of the family and as a person in general. He looked at Asel and said goodnight, divine beast Munrepe. At this point, the baby was almost asleep. She waved her hand at him and squeaked. The next day, there was to be a dinner between the second son and his father. The serving woman, trying to save her husband, glanced back furtively before changing the bottles. Her master was right there. She knew she couldn't make a mistake, otherwise she would lose her beloved. Beyonce thought with satisfaction that all preparations were completed. This day was to decide his fate. He already understood that everything would definitely happen today. He had been waiting for it for so long that his hands were itching with impatience. At that moment, his father entered the room, suspecting nothing. However, his son stopped him and asked what he had brought with him. There was a lizard in his father's hand, and the Lord replied that it was the one that had been summoned this time. The Lord said he thought they should meet. Beyonce said tensely that he was very pleased, calling her a lizard. Asel snapped back as usual that she was not a lizard at all, and he wondered why the Lord had brought this monster along at all. The father ordered her to be seated next to him. In person, she looked even more disgusting, but the son didn't say anything, barely holding back. He needed to pour wine down the old man's throat as quickly as possible. At that moment, Asel said that she wanted a strawberry, and the grandfather replied that she should wait a little. After this, the old man turned to his son and asked if he had thought about what he had done, and if he was ready to hand over the sacred animals to his nephew. Beyonce answered in the affirmative, stating that it was his father's order and he had to carry it out. The Lord did not expect such behavior from his son and asked what was happening to him. Had he really decided to obey without the long resistance he usually showed? Beyonce tried to smile as sincerely as possible, realizing that for such a matter it was worth enduring a little, and said that he deeply regretted what he had done. After this, he announced that he had brought a rare wine, difficult to obtain in the Empire, and he invited his father to have a drink with him, like in the good old days. However, the father covered his glass with his hand, declaring that there was a child there and wine was inappropriate. After that, he told him to bring grape juice, and his son's plan fell apart right before his eyes. The father put his hand on Asil's head and said that she was still a child, adding that she still had a shell on her head. Beyonce had to think of something urgently. He started to play on pity and said that this was the first dinner together after a long break and they could have a little drink. But his father's word was always law, and even before that, Beyonce could not resist him. He said nothing even when he appointed Evander Duke. And now his father was protecting this strange monster. Beyonce could not stand it any longer. He felt with all his soul that he had to get rid of him today and take back his place. But this required cunning. He had to pretend to be a dutiful son, so he said as gently as possible that he was very sorry and asked to drink at least one glass. Father rolled his eyes and thought that since he was so remorseful, perhaps not everything in him was bad. He decided to be kind and said that he could pour some wine. Beyonce immediately thanked him, freezing in anticipation. When he was pouring the wine, the little girl smelled a strange odor, which she mentioned out loud and told her grandfather not to drink it. He turned around and said that it was called wine, and that when she grew up she would understand what it tasted like. Beyonce was practically jumping with impatience, praying with all his might that his father would take a sip as soon as possible. The words were almost on his lips, but his father did not notice how impatiently he was looking at him. After taking a sip, the Lord said that the taste of the wine was indeed strange, so bitter that it left his tongue numb. He asked what it was made of and suddenly felt sick. Suddenly he started coughing and blood spurted out of his mouth. Asel screamed in fear. She didn't know what to do. Falling onto the table, the father said that there was poison in the glass, but nothing could be changed, and the little girl only screamed helplessly. The old lord was examined by a doctor, and his prognosis was not encouraging. After listening to the heart, he tried to prepare the family for the worst-case scenario. He informed the young duke that his grandfather's condition was very serious. Evander didn't believe it. He asked what it meant. The doctor said that it seemed that Lord Elkai had taken a poison called Angel's Tears, a very dangerous potion. It is called so because one drop allows one to go to the angels painlessly, but there is no antidote due to its high lethality. Beyonce cried out that this was nonsense, and where had it ever been seen in the world that there was a poison without an antidote? He fell on the bed, clenching his fists and screaming that he should have drunk the wine first. He thought to himself how annoying it was that everyone found out he should have gotten rid of the bottle, then no one would have realized what kind of poison it was. If it weren't for that lizard, who was now trying with all her might to make Grandpa talk, he would have poured the whole bottle into his mouth and finished him off once and for all. Evander asked if there was any way to disable it. Any method, if there is even the slightest chance, he is ready to use it. The doctor said that there was actually one way to detox, but it was too complicated. Beyonce almost went into shock. He was sure that this poison was beyond his control. Her lips even began to tremble. He was so disappointed because the goal was so close. Evander immediately asked what this method consisted of. The doctor replied that, according to ancient texts, a priestess born in the year of a god's birth is endowed with special divine power. The book stated that her abilities were limitless. This baby, who will grow up in the future, will be able to bring a dying person back to life with one movement of his hand. To do this, you just need to find her, and then there will be a chance to bring your grandfather back. However, the owner of such divine power is born only once a century. Beyonce was finally able to exhale and assume that, most likely, such a thing simply did not exist. However, the Duke noted that, as far as he knew, a whole century had passed since the death of the last Holy Virgin, which meant that there might be a saint or saints who met these conditions. The doctor replied that it was likely, but there were no guarantees, since she still needed to be found. Beyonce said irritably that if such a thing existed, the temple would have announced it long ago, and maybe they should focus on catching the criminal. Evander, who had to make all the decisions, asked if there were any other antidotes and received a negative answer. He called his servants. The Duke said that they must find the priestess born on the god's birthday at any cost. However, Beyonce insisted that the criminal had to be caught first, and that could wait. But his nephew turned around and firmly said that finding the priestess was the priority at the moment. Since he was the Duke, it was he who decided where to direct his forces. Beyonce had to restrain himself from yelling at him out loud. He knew he had to hold back now. Soon the era of Evander's reign would come to an end, and in the meantime, Asel tried to understand what this man was thinking. She appeared so unexpectedly that he jumped, and then asked where the lizard came from, to which he received, as usual, the answer that Asel was not a lizard. Beyonce couldn't resist and kicked her, shouting, and she walked away. After that, he turned away and headed down the corridor, not wanting to play out this comedy any longer. Asel felt offended and wondered why he was angry with her, since she hadn't done anything bad to him. Then she looked towards the room and saw her upset husband. He was very sad, and she wanted to somehow ease his pain. After all, her husband promised to make her the most important person in the entire estate, and for this to happen, he needed to be in a good mood. And grandfather, even though he said that Asel was ugly, still treated her to a bunch of strawberries, although he took the food away, but this was only once, when she herself offered it. The main thing for Asel was that her husband was sad, and it hurt her to watch it. He sat next to his grandfather's bed, not understanding why he deserved such a fate. He lost his mother, then his father, and now his grandfather. He had no one left. Asel also became very sad. She saw how sad he was and wanted to fix it. She decided that being the head of such a family would not bring her anything good, and she needed to save her grandfather. But how could she do this? Because she was too small and did not know how to heal people. She returned to her little room, climbed into bed, and tried to think of a way out. Suddenly, a bright thought struck her. Her mother had once told her about this. In one book, she read that in order to save her grandfather, she needed to find a person named Heroine. The little girl had no idea who it was, and the rabbit slept peacefully, not paying any attention to her torment. Asel tried to remember who this Heroine priestess student was. She remembered the description. She had pink hair. The girl was about the same age as the main character, that is, her husband. At that time, Asel did not know whether she was born on the same day as the god, but the book said that she healed. So this girl was definitely a holy virgin, and Asel began to prepare for her campaign. She took her gold patterns and some strawberries because she definitely needed a snack, after which she told the bunny, who was still sleeping, that she was going. She rushed forward so resolutely that she didn't even think about where she should go or what she should do. But in the middle of the corridor, this thought crept into her head and she stopped. She didn't know where the heroine lived or how to get out of the castle, which she never left. Lost in thought, she hid in a corner and began to squeak as usual. This helped her think. At first, she decided that she could ask her husband for help, but she changed her mind because if the heroine suddenly couldn't heal her grandfather, he might be disappointed. Asura told herself that she didn't know what to do when suddenly she heard the guard knight call out to her. He asked what she was doing there, and Asura already had a plan in her head. To get your way, you had to be as nice as possible. She turned to him and greeted him joyfully. Instinctively, the knight pulled his hand back, his herpetophobia waking up again. The lizard bites from his childhood still haunted him. Asura asked him if he knew where the priestesses lived. He replied that unless there was special business, they were mostly in the temple. Before he had time to ask why she needed this, Asura informed him that he would have to go somewhere with her. The knight did not understand where, but she did not answer, only said that if he went, he would find out. Then she resolutely headed towards the exit. Dylan still couldn't figure out what she was up to. But at that moment they were already riding in a carriage. On the way, Asura told him everything, and he realized that they needed to find the novice with pink hair. It turned out that she must be a girl of about the same age as the Duke. Their goal became clear: to find the Holy Virgin. Asura handed Dylan a strawberry, showing her gratitude for his assistance. However, he refused, and she said that she would then eat everything herself. The knight remembered what she had done on the training ground last time. There was also the time when she fought with the sacred bear beast, and he became curious about what she was going to do this time. He asked her the reason for looking for this novice. She replied that it was a secret and could not be shared. The knight smiled and said that it was clear, but all this was very disturbing for him. She said that she can't say yet, because it is unknown whether the heroine will be able to cure her grandfather, as in the book. And while her mouth was covered with a strawberry, he said that it was better for her to hide her true nature. The little girl was surprised and asked why. He replied that if the divine beast itself came to take the novice, there would be a lot of explaining to do, and there was a good chance that things would not go as they planned. Asura was surprised and asked what she should do then, and the knight thought about it. The carriage was already approaching the right place, but he was still silent. However, a plan had already begun to form in his head. When they arrived, Asura agreed not to reveal her identity. At this time, the head of the temple was reviewing the contracts. He couldn't understand how this happened. There was no loophole to get money. Most of the novices were children of aristocrats, and he thought he could line his pockets with bribes. The money was supposed to be for looking after their children, but all he had were random orphans from the slums. Just yesterday, some pervert offered some money to take some girl. Although it was small, it was still an income, and the monk had already begun to become disillusioned with his service. At that moment, someone entered the room and announced that the priest had a guest. He indignantly asked what other guest. Had someone really done something wrong again? They told him that the guest said he wanted to take Selena. He was talking about that same impudent girl who didn't know her place. He didn't want to see her so much that yesterday he almost sold her to that perverted aristocrat. The monk asked who wanted to see and take this girl. He was told that this man was from the Duchy of Monarepe, so the Duke is a rich man and there is a chance to get enough money. He immediately said why they didn't tell him about this right away and hurried to meet the guest. He thought to himself that no matter how much bad things were said about the state of affairs in Munrep, the duchy remained a duchy. Money was calling him. He hurried with all his might. Trying to be polite, he asked if the guests were tired from the journey, and, unable to resist, immediately got down to business, asking why they were looking for Selena. He also asked how they knew about her and began to put his plan into action. Dylan said that when the Duke visited the place, he was with his pet. And then this girl got along very well with him. Dylan said he was deeply impressed, and then revealed that the animal's name was Pippi. The priest decided not to get lost and said that Selena was a very kind and smart girl, but unfortunately, there was already someone who wanted to take her away. Perhaps they needed another girl. Asura said that there was no other person, and tried to make sure that only the knight heard. The priest admitted that since they both wanted the same girl, he didn't know what to do. Waiting for him to finally be offered good money, the knight began to understand what he was getting at. At that point, the priest said that they knew the church put the child's interests first. "And where does this happiness come from?" he asked. The knight did not know and could not answer this. The priest, without embarrassment, said that it came straight from the money. The temple needs money to buy beautiful clothes and jewelry, and to ensure that the novices look good and eat delicious food. All this costs a lot of money, and the knight remembered the rumors about this temple. However, he didn't think that children were actually being trafficked here. In the end, this meant that the priest would give the child to the highest bidder. Dylan had some savings, but it was a very small amount. After repairing the wooden dolls that young Mrs. Asel had broken, there was almost nothing left, but he still handed over the little bag, all covered in patches. The priest opened it and his face showed displeasure. He said that this was not enough to make the child happy. Dylan promised to bring more later, but the priest noted that happiness cannot be bought on credit. The knight asked how much he had been offered yesterday, but did not have time to wait for an answer. At this point, Asel decided to enter the game and threw a coin on the table that looked very much like a gold one. Dylan began to sweat. If the deception was revealed now, it would become clear that these were toy coins. But the little girl decided to invest all her wealth, believing that she was very smart. After all, this is exactly how a duke's pet should behave. The glitter of gold left the priest speechless. He asked if the young lady was really giving him all her wealth. Peepai quietly replied that yes, he would get everything. The priest said that this would be enough to make his girl happy. After that, he ordered Selena to be taken immediately. Dylan thought that maybe he really had bad eyesight and didn't see the coins as he should have. At that moment, Asil touched the knight with her paw, trying to get praise. She thought he would say that she was a good girl, because everything worked out, but his trauma associated with the reptiles reminded him of itself again, and he flinched. But now was not the time to focus on the baby. Dylan cringed inwardly, but decided to let everything go its own way. Nothing could be fixed now. At that moment, a cry was heard from the corridor, demanding that she be let go. A melodic female voice called everyone damned bastards. They saw the soft pink hair fly up. Dylan saw golden eyes, which were very rare. However, the girl's mouth was pressed tightly, as if she was ready to curse them. It was clear that she was not happy with what was happening. It was with this mouth that she screamed for them to die, calling them damned perverts. The whole point was that Selena was reborn. She lived in a country called South Korea and was an ordinary office worker. But one day, as she was returning home, reading a romantic fantasy on her phone, she was hit by a truck. At first there was emptiness. Then, opening her eyes, she discovered that she had entered into the main character of this novel. She had been reading romantic fantasy for 15 years, hundreds of works, and this situation did not seem too surprising to her. In romantic fantasy, characters usually possess dark heroes and change their fate. But she didn't understand why she ended up in the body of a good character. Although the story was so-so, its heroine was sold as a child to a perverted aristocrat and suffered for some time. She wondered if this was the case when, after meeting the main character, life completely changes for the better. So Selena was mentally preparing herself for the fact that one day this perverted aristocrat would take her away, but she didn't think that it would happen right now. The priest demanded that she say hello. Selena noticed that the timing was very strange. Perhaps there was another immigrant besides her. However, from the knight's appearance, she realized that he could hardly be a pervert, and then she saw Asil. She knew this little girl and understood what would happen if everything went according to the original scenario. Altogether, they were already riding in the carriage, and this time the knight was silent. Selena also did not know what to say. Asil and the girl looked at each other because they knew a little more. Selena remembered the description of this sacred animal, black as pitch, round face, huge as beads, pink pupils. The whole body was covered with black scales, and on the head there were horns that had not yet grown. Without a doubt, it was Asil, the small beast dragon summoned by the main character in the original story. But Selena didn't understand why she was here, because immediately after being summoned, the dragon spews flames, killing the knights. Then she wounded the protagonist because she was supposed to be locked in the tower. The fact that she was now in front of Selena meant that she was also a displaced person, although it was still possible that she had returned to the past or been reborn. In any case, it must undergo a second life to change the unfortunate fate of the original work. This, in principle, did not bode well when two settlers appear in one novel. One of them, the one who moved into the main character, always shouts that everything is not going according to plan. Eventually, when faced with opposition, he collapses, and it is probably Selena. At that moment, the little dragon spoke and said that his name was Asil. However, Selena felt that this was not all. After which the little dragon added, saying that she was the most important one in ManhwaCapped. Selena wondered if she really wanted to scare her right away. Deciding to defuse the situation, she asked why they had come for her, and Asil replied that everything was fine. Selena shouldn't be afraid of her, even though she's a fierce dragon. The girl understood that the time of difficulties had come, and she had to make a choice to fight fiercely for the place of the main character or to hide the fact that she was a displaced person in order to save her life. While she was about to say something, Asil interrupted her. She said that she would give up her husband to her. That's what her mother told her. The little girl just recently remembered how she said that Asura was from a different species and should give up her husband to the human heroine. Therefore, she does not need to be afraid of her. As a sign of friendship, Asura extended her hand to the girl and said that she promised. However, Selena thought that the little dragon was now trying to escape. In the book, after she rescues and takes care of the hapless protagonist, she runs away. But he can't let her go and pursues her. He becomes distraught. It seems that Asura is now using his new acquaintance as a shield. Selena raised her hand and said that it was okay. There was no need to give in to her. Asura only squeaked, and Selena thought that this world would revolve around the dragon anyway, and there was no point in creating unnecessary competition. After all, it could even put her life at risk, so Selena already had a plan. From that moment on, she consciously refused the role of the main character. Finally, they arrived at the palace. Asura, tired, climbed onto her grandfather's bed and said that she had come to save him. At this point, the doctor asked if they had really brought the girl from the temple. He remarked that he was unsure whether she would be able to use divine power at all, since if that were known, she would most likely have already taken the position of a mid-ranking priest. And if she had been born on the day of God's birth, she would have been immediately proclaimed a saint. However, realizing why she had been brought here, Selena rolled up her sleeves and pushed the doctor away. She decided that she could use the power and quickly heal this man so that she could go on her way. The doctor was a little surprised by the girl's behavior. She seemed rather rude. And Selena suddenly tensed up, because if she screwed up here, she wouldn't die at the hands of that boy. She will have a completely different death. She will simply be killed by this lizard's paw. She decided that she had to reveal all the power that she had previously hidden, and she tried to tune herself in. After that, she directed rays of light towards the lying man. The doctor was simply stunned. Could this really be divine power? It seemed impossible. At that moment, the young duke prayed for everything to work out. He didn't want to lose his grandfather. Asura looked with admiration and was amazed at how beautifully everything sparkled. Suddenly, Selena realized that she was weak and unable to cleanse her body of the strong poison. If she had lived a few more years, her divine power would have completely restored it. However, in this state, it was beyond her strength. She tried with all her might to knock out all the remaining poison from the man, but it was not enough. Selena desperately wanted to get it done faster, but she understood that she was not yet in danger of freedom. She wanted to escape before it got dark, while there was still a chance to get far away from the temple and these people. At that moment, the man suddenly opened his eyes. The duke trembled all over from the stress he had endured and called out to his grandfather while Asura was crying next to him. The lord asked if he was dead. The first thing he saw was pink-eyed Asura. The doctor finally woke up from his stupor and joyfully said that, on the contrary, he was alive. The young lady Asura had brought a saint born on the day of the god's appearance. Lord Elkai chuckled and said that he now owed his life to the lizard, after which he stroked her head and said that he was glad she was okay. The little girl closed one eye with pleasure and said that she was very strong. Lord Elkai noticed that his grandson had completely fallen apart and said that the duke should not cry. The little boy, who had no childhood, tried to hold on with all his might, but tears flowed and he asked for forgiveness. After this, the lord looked at the girl and asked if it was really she who saved him. She didn't answer, but the doctor confirmed that everything was correct. This was the saint that the young lady had brought. The lord noticed that she seemed to have worked too hard for him and promised to reward her generously. The doctor asked for forgiveness for having to say this. There was still poison in the master's body, and the treatment must continue as the saint's strength was restored. The young duke approached her and asked if she would mind staying there and continuing her treatment. Selena thought, why does everything turn out like this again and again? If she remains a saint, then, as in the original, she will marry the protagonist, and she will possibly be killed by Asura. Because that's how it was in the original, and she really didn't want to die at the hands of this little dragon. First of all, she needed to avoid the fate of a saint. She said that instead of a reward, she had one request, and the Lord asked what it was. She asked them not to tell anyone that she had divine powers, and then hesitated. And then she added that she wanted to be made Lady Asura's servant. To say that everyone was surprised is to say nothing. Asura herself was especially amazed. The physician asked Selena if she might be better off becoming an official saint instead of a servant. However, she stood her ground and said that she did not want to return to the temple. There she was always bullied because she was an orphan from the slums. The doctor sighed loudly, and the grandfather asked why she wanted to be Asil's servant. The girl replied that the young lady recognized her value, came for her, and she wanted to serve her in order to repay her at least a little for this favor. After this, she turned directly to Asil and asked to be taken as a servant. Finally, the stormy events died down a bit, and it was time for everyone to go to bed. Evander told Selena that she had worked hard until late at night, and the girl replied that she had only done what she had to. The Duke said that he would delegate the tasks of taking care of Lady Selena's bedroom to the maids. When she was sent to rest, she found herself at a loss and wondered how to get out of this situation. Mom warned Asil that she needed to be careful with the heroine and wondered why she wanted to become her servant. When she left, her husband told Asil to think carefully. He noted that there were many ways to reward Selena, and if Asil did not want her to serve her, she could refuse. The little girl cooed and said that she would definitely think about it. Then she asked if her husband had found the criminal who had done this to her grandfather. The Duke was embarrassed and replied that he had not yet, and suddenly he became very upset and said that she probably considered him pathetic because she went after the priestess, and he himself did nothing. Asil noticed that the suspect was currently out of town and was said to have been last seen in a barn behind the castle. After that, she touched her husband's leg with her paw and said that he was a good boy. She then added that it was because Beyonce had taken everyone to the hunting grounds without permission that her husband was having problems. She added that her grandfather's son was strange, and the Duke asked how she knew that. The little girl replied that she knew everything, and added that she had not heard this from the human knight, since she had to keep his secret. Asil remembered how he had told her this directly, but the Duke thought that Dylan was probably telling her everything, and that he would have to tell him to keep his mouth shut. When they were about to go to their rooms, Asil wished him to hold on. Then she added that she was leaving, and he tried to stop her. However, she had already closed the door, and he decided that she was probably very tired. But he didn't even properly thank her for saving his grandfather or greet her properly. It upset him so much that he was ready to cry, but the day had already been too hard. Asil noted with satisfaction that she had saved her grandfather, and now it was time to do other things. She needed to punish the man who had tormented him so much. The knight said that the suspect is now trying to hide behind the castle, so she needs to go there to find him. She looked out the window and saw that snow had already fallen outside the castle, and Asil did not like the cold. She went into her bins and decided that she needed to get some sufficient equipment. She finally found what she wanted. Her mother also gave it to her. The little fur coat that kept her warm suited her very well. This cape was able to protect her even from severe frosts, for which Asil was grateful to her mother, who sewed it. She looked at the bunny, who was clearly not ready for the difficult hike. However, she also found clothes for him, because she could not set out on the journey alone. Without regret, she woke up the sleeping bunny and, tugging at his hand, dragged him along with her. He didn't even have time to understand what was happening. She hurried, saying that if they left now, they would be able to return before dark. Of course, she underestimated the cold outside. The entire area around the house was already covered in snow, and unexpected people appeared behind the castle. One man approached the fox and spoke to him kindly. He said he thought he was missing, and then, patting him on the withers, noted that it was cold outside and they needed to go inside. Picking up the fox cub, he added that other people would soon arrive and they should leave. Asil walked through the snowdrifts, cursing the cold. The bunny was even less enthusiastic. He didn't even have a proper cape. However, they had to go faster, and finally Asil realized that she was already close to the right place. It seemed like this was the very barn they were talking about, and there was an abandoned tower nearby, but for some reason she felt creepy. She really hoped that there were no ghosts there, as she was very afraid of them. So, being a wise organizer, she pushed the bunny forward and told him to go first. So that he wouldn't be afraid, she assured him that she would definitely save him if something happened. The baby desperately resisted, but Asil hurried him. She literally pushed him with her feet inside the door, but he didn't want to go at all. He clearly didn't understand that the entire success of the operation depended on him, and Asil explained that he had to cover the rear. She finally pushed him too hard and he fell to the floor. She immediately turned to him, feeling guilty, and asked for forgiveness, asking if he was okay. At that moment, a red light flashed past them. The little dragon and the even smaller rabbit screamed together. They saw a red fox with black paws and ears. Looking at them, she snorted and said that they were making too much noise. Asil was delighted, after which she greeted the fox and apologized for the noise. He stretched again, chuckled, and paid no attention to them. The little dragon decided not to miss the chance and asked if she could ask the fox a question. When he waved his tail, she felt that he smelled the same as her husband. It wasn't Grandpa's scent. It wasn't Beyonce's, she wanted to ask, but there was no time to talk. They rushed after the little fox. They absolutely had to find out something from him. Asura screamed and called the fox cub, trying to find out if he lived here. The fox cub didn't even turn around. He just wagged his tail but didn't answer. Then Asura decided to ask another question and asked if he had seen a woman there. She even tried to depict what it looks like by showing it on herself. She didn't have a portrait. Dylan showed it to her, but the image turned out quite convincing. The little fox turned to Asura and said that she was ugly. In response, she came up to her and said that she was not ugly, but that you can't talk to her like that. The fox cub asked why she was looking for this woman. Asura replied that this woman had hurt her grandfather. She intended to find her and punish her. When the little girl said her name, the fox stopped. He turned around and asked if this meant that she was the divine beast from the rumors, the ugly lizard. Asura jumped up again and declared that she was neither ugly nor a lizard, but a brave and courageous dragon. The fox cub turned around and asked why she was standing there, since she was looking for a human woman. The little girl realized that she needed to follow the fox cub so that he could show her where the woman was. There was a lot more snow in the forest, and the little dragon was not prepared for it. She was even more surprised that the smell here was stronger, just like her husband's. Maybe he was somewhere nearby. But he didn't even know where she was going. It didn't seem very true. At that moment, the fox cub approached some object and lifted it up. He said that Asura could take her if he could. The baby pulled the woman quite easily, and the fox began to question who she was. However, Asura was no longer listening. She was thinking about how she needed to quickly go and show this woman to her husband and grandfather. Then they will no doubt praise her for being a brave and reliable dragon. She pulled the heavy load, saying, as they will say, that Asura is very brave and reliable. Asura loved it when people praised her, because she was still a little girl and needed such words. At that moment, two people walked towards them. They didn't quarrel among themselves, but were indignant, asking where she had gone. One grumbled at the other, saying that it should have been destroyed immediately. The other one replied that he had a stomachache, and that was why they did not complete the task. At some point they stopped when they saw someone dragging the missing woman. It appeared to be an ordinary lizard, so small that it was difficult to see. It seemed that Asura was hungry. She had no strength because of hunger. Then a branch snapped in the hand of one of the men, and she heard them. But she didn't pay attention. It was already too difficult for her. However, she heard a call. Someone shouted, calling her a little lizard. She turned around and saw the men with confused eyes. They thought that such a little girl looked quite cute. One of the men noticed her fear, but the other said that stealing was bad. Asura had a good sense of smell, and she immediately recognized the smell emanating from them. It was exactly the same as that of Beyonce, my grandfather's second son. The man grabbed his sword and declared that if she gave the woman up in good faith, he would kill her with one blow. Asura, although she was tired, pouted and said that she would not give it back. She declared that she would fight the bad people, no matter what it cost her, and the bunny crawled further away so as not to accidentally get hit. The man noted that she was quite brave, but asked what she could do against them. The little girl clenched her fists and decided to fight back. She shouted that Asura was very brave, although at that time her heart was beating wildly, trying to warm up and give out energy. She wanted to release a large flame, but only a small puff came out. The little girl sighed and thought that the flame had not come out because of hunger, and it was completely unclear how to figure it out now. One of the men said that although he was going to send her into the light with one blow, it wouldn't work. She asked for it herself. She was so impudent. He swung his sword, but the little girl, out of fear, didn't even try to run away. In panic, she grabbed her head with her hands and screamed, "Save Akil!" She didn't notice what happened next, as she was too excited to see. When she opened her eyes again, there were two people lying in the snow. She was surprised and looked around, not understanding what had happened. In front of her stood a golden-haired man with a sword. He looked exactly like her husband. He smelled the same, so it was someone she hadn't seen yet but could smell, whom her mother warned her about, that is, he was her husband's father. But then her strength began to leave her. She was clearly overexcited, and her heart was tired. The man turned around and told her not to tell anyone that she had seen him. The little girl was left alone in the middle of the forest. She had a lot of thoughts. The man's face was similar to her husband's, and the smell was the same. He also had a younger face than his grandfather, which confirmed that he was definitely his father. Just as she was about to shout for him to stop, he suddenly disappeared. She quietly, hesitantly called him, calling him father, but in response there was no sound, not a rustle. There was a tower in front of her, and she heard that he was imprisoned in it, how he managed to get out, and was it possible to do this without being noticed. At that moment, Beyonce and his knights were riding back from hunting. His servants said that the catch today was magnificent. The knight first called him Lord Beyonce, and then added that from now on he should be called Duke. He noted that discipline would finally be restored in the family. He then added that he was tired of serving under the young Duke, and could now breathe a sigh of relief. Beyonce noted that he too was tired of all this. In his thoughts, he thought that he should have dealt with his father earlier, because of whom he suffered so much. Then he remarked that he was too soft-hearted, and that was the whole problem, and added that the weather was fine, perhaps they should have a drink. The knights accepted this idea favorably. If the Duke himself pours, they will always gladly join in. They were already approaching the castle when they suddenly saw something unexpected. There was a crowd of knights standing in front of the castle. Before them stood the young Duke. Beyonce chuckled, not understanding why so many people were greeting him. He stopped his horse and greeted the Duke, calling him his nephew. Then he asked why he was here, but the boy's gaze was stern. He loudly declared that Beyonce Munrepe would lose his castle for attempting to poison the former Duke of El Kai, and that he himself would suffer severe punishment. Beyonce was surprised, asking what poisoning, are there really sons who try to kill their fathers? Evander replied that no one could have thought that someone from Munrepe's family could commit the crime, but his maid told everything. Deciding to play the simpleton, Beyonce asked Evander to speak more clearly so that he could at least answer. After which he noticed that the boy had apparently gone crazy after his father's death, and he declared that his patience had its limits. He could not throw around such insults without punishment. But Evander didn't buy into this show. He firmly stated that the former Duke of El Kai was alive, and he stood behind every word he said. This, of course, surprised Beyonce. At that moment the knights called him. Someone reported that the poison in Mr. El Kai's body was neutralized last night, and the one who added it to the wine was also captured. Beyonce thought, so that's why those knights haven't returned yet. Evander said that if he surrendered now, his life would be spared. The second son could not believe that such a severe punishment was being discussed. However, he was not ready to back down so easily. Now that the attempt to poison his father had become known, the punishment could be very severe. He faced not only the loss of his ducal title, but also execution. In that case, he had no choice but to call on the knights to fight for him. He loudly declared that his nephew, hiding behind his weak father, had announced that he would kill him. Then he added that it was a pity that his father had fallen ill, but in this world there are things that can be done, and things that cannot. And how can one threaten one's uncle in order to strengthen one's power? Is such a person worthy of becoming the head of the family? After which he raised his sword up and called on the knights to do the same. He invited everyone to join in the glorious birth of the new Duke of Munrepe. Despite his youth, Evander was very wise and courageous. He took out his sword and declared all those who spoke on Beyonce's side to be traitors. After this, he gave the order to kill everyone. The battle continued for some time with varying success. Neither side was ready to surrender. The young Duke also fought, despite his youth and short stature. Beyonce felt that the outcome of the battle was still unclear, despite their numerical superiority. He suddenly realized that if this continued, they could all die. Then he ordered that all the divine beasts be released. On their side was now the terrible eagle, ready to tear the knights and the Duke apart. They were immediately joined by a lion and a leopard, which could cause significant damage. The young Duke said with disdain that divine beasts could not be used and urged his supporters not to retreat and continue to fight. The claws of the beasts were very dangerous, and the balance of power fell on Beyonce's side. But he understood that even if they won, they would suffer huge losses. Dylan, fighting on the Duke's side and battling the lion, already realized that the fight was going to be difficult. He thought that young Mrs. Aesel, with her small fist, like a fern sprout, would have knocked out this damned lion with one blow. However, she was not on their side now, and the lion was clearly winning. It was not easy for an ordinary knight to fight a divine beast, although he hoped to survive. At one point, he could not bear it any longer and began to call for help, hoping that the young Lady Aesel would hear him. At that moment, the paw of a small dragon softly touched the ground. With a loud cry, she rushed towards the huge lion. Despite the difference in size, the lion was thrown far and hard. Aesel dealt with him almost effortlessly and continued the fight. On the way here, she ate a lot of strawberries, so she was full of energy. She easily dealt with the other animals, which were significantly larger than her. It is absolutely unclear where the little dragon got such power from. She didn't stop and look to see who to punish next. The balance of the battle had clearly shifted, and victory was now more on the side of the young knight than Beyonce. The knights whispered among themselves, calling her a monster. However, they were not ready to deal with her and decided to run away screaming for help. Beyonce shouted after them, demanding that they quickly return and fight. At that moment, Asil jumped onto the muzzle of the horse he was riding. Evander ordered that he and all the remaining knights be captured. No one should escape. After some time, they were celebrating their victory. Once Asil entered the battle, the outcome changed in an instant. Victory was on Evander's side, Beyonce was defeated, and he no longer had a chance to change his fate. His vassals, having lost their fighting spirit, were captured one after another. Their leader resisted to the last, but it did not help him, and in the end, he too was defeated. The young duke stood before him, preparing to pass judgment. Despite the fact that he was his own uncle, Evander remained impartial. When it was all over, he raised his sword and called on his vassals to rejoice. He reported that the civil war had been defeated at the very beginning, and the duchy had now come to unity. This meant that there was a chance to revive its former glory and greatness, which the young ruler so desperately strove for. They won, and the divine being that now belonged to the Duchy of Manhwa played a significant role in this. The knights were delighted and shouted joyfully. However, Asil did not share this delight and suddenly squealed, clutching her husband's head. Evander was surprised at first, but then he realized that she was frightened by the victory cry and carefully lowered it from his head. Holding her gently under his arm, he tried to calm her down, noting that nothing terrible had happened. He looked into her eyes and said that there was no need to be afraid. Everything was fine because it was all over. Then he sincerely thanked her for her help. He said that all this happened solely because of her. Finally, the little girl received the long-awaited praise that she had dreamed about and was happy about. She extended her paw towards her husband's face. No matter that she had already decided to give him to the main character, she still had warm feelings for him. The Duke pressed her head to his and they both laughed. They had succeeded. At this time, things were not going as happily in the Dark Tower as outside it. The gloomy corridors created a feeling of hopelessness. Anyone who entered there was considered already dead. There were cobwebs hanging around, which made the room look even more musty. Beyonce suffered from the experience of what had happened, blaming it all on that damn lizard. He was sure that if it weren't for her, everything would have worked out for him, the plan with the sacred bear beast, the poisoning of his father, and even the subsequent civil strife. Everything would have collapsed because of this lizard. Suddenly he realized that it was not his father he should be afraid of, but this little bug. He firmly decided that as soon as he got out of here, he would definitely kill her. At this time, his father came up to him and said that there was not a drop of remorse visible on his face. He asked his son if he had expected too much from him, but he did not feel guilty. Beyonce jumped up and, going up to the bars, declared that everything happened because of him. Father did nothing but indulge Evander all the time. The Lord asked what this was expressed in. The son said that the elder brother's actions had almost destroyed the entire family, and the place of the next head should rightfully go to Beyonce. So why did some brat suddenly become the heir? He looked firmly into his father's face and asked if his words were wrong. After all, the father did not even think about making his second son a duke, although he had every right to do so. The Lord turned away and said that before appointing the next head, he tested his offspring for moral qualities. He reminded his son how he sent him and Evander into the snowfields. It was a real test of strength for them. Beyonce said that he remembered this, and also that whoever could survive a month in the desert without anything would become the next duke. He also remembered very well that Evander had returned not on his own feet, but on someone else's back. He was brought to the weakened and defeated, yet he received status. The Lord asked if his son knew why Evander was carried on his back. He replied that it was probably because he had miscalculated his strength, and making someone like him a duke wasn't that indulgence. The father said that in order to test the two of them, he sent one man. It was a knight disguised as a resident of their lands who had gotten into trouble. Beyonce didn't know about this, waiting for his father to tell him more. The Lord noted that his son not only mercilessly drove away the knight as a burden, but also, to prevent rumors from reaching his father, buried him in the snow and even checked to see if he was dead. But Evander, on the contrary, was stupidly generous and even gave him his share. How could the Lord make Beyonce the head of the family, someone who was willing to turn his back on the inhabitants of their lands for the sake of his own salvation? Beyonce replied that if he had known that the man was a resident of their lands, he would not have abandoned him so mercilessly, especially near other people's possessions. He thought that the man was from there. The father sharply told him to stop talking. He had had enough. He took a dagger from his bosom and handed it to his son. Then he said that out of respect for the fact that Beyonce was his son, he would not kill him with his own hands. However, it was better for him to commit suicide to avoid shame. After this, the father turned around and left, Beyonce shouting, demanding that he come back, outraged by his actions towards his own son. The Lord heard his screams but did not want to stop. Suddenly, he froze in front of the painting of the fox, wondering if it was still there. He would have to order it removed as soon as possible. After that, he turned around and headed towards the exit. Beyonce slowly went mad, alone in his cell. He held in his hands the dagger his father had given him, determined that he would not leave this world in this way. He laughed hysterically, then began to cry, thinking about his father's words, overwhelmed by strong emotions. It turned out that he did not become the head of the family for such an insignificant reason. If he had only known how everything would turn out, he would have long ago gotten rid of his father and headed the duchy. At that moment, footsteps were heard, and a hope flashed in Beyonce's soul that his father had changed his mind, but his heart told him of danger. Hope quickly faded, and he decided that it was most likely the jailer. He understood that now, having a weapon, he could kill him and take the keys. A man in a cloak appeared in front of him. Beyonce hid the dagger behind his back, preparing for battle. In his mind, he urged the stranger to come closer so that he could strike. He waited silently, hoping that he would come closer. However, the man kept his distance and there was no opportunity to strike. Suddenly a familiar voice sounded, which Beyonce immediately recognized. This caused him shock and mixed feelings. He was amazed. He had not seen this man for many years and did not expect to meet him alive. Beyonce looked at him carefully, not daring to speak, fear, surprise, and hope beating inside him. The lowered hood removed all doubts his older brother stood before him. Beyonce was stunned, warmth and cold filling his senses at the same time. He tried to say the words he hadn't said for a long time, and despite his hesitation, he called the man brother. But he squeezed the dagger tighter in his hand, preparing for a possible collision. Despite being confined to the tower, his older brother looked surprisingly well, strong and determined. Beyonce thought to himself that this was the brother who had incurred the wrath of the divine beast, had lost his power, and had been imprisoned. The unspoken question about the reasons for his appearance here made his heart flutter. The brother extended his hand and said that if Beyonce remained alive, he would become a source of trouble. He was determined and understood that recklessness was unacceptable, and he had no choice. His voice was cold and dispassionate. He invited his younger brother to come closer. Beyonce raised his hands, demonstrating the absence of weapons. He dropped the dagger with which he was going to kill the jailer, realizing the pointlessness of using it now. The elder brother had already drawn a sword that would render the dagger ineffective. Beyonce stuttered as he asked to be heard and for time to explain. An internal conflict raged within him, fear and hope intertwined with determination. He was ready for any outcome, from peace to battle. In those moments, the cold of reason and the heat of an emotional struggle that could change everything were mixed. However, his brother's eyes were relentless. The decision had already been made. He plunged the sword straight into Beyonce's chest, and he only managed to breathe out the beginning of a word. His legs gave way, and he realized that this was the end. Trying to hold his chest, where the wound hurt like crazy, he realized that there was no turning back. He fell heavily onto the stone surface, his arms dropping, and blood filled the space around him. The elder brother touched the younger one's shoulder. He remembered him as he was. He didn't remember their childhood, but only how Beyonce behaved after difficult events. Having firmly pronounced the words of farewell, without saying a single parting word to his younger brother, he simply silently left him to die. But suddenly, having thought, he said goodbye, my mediocre brother. This man's life ended as senselessly as it had begun from the moment he grew up. Eckhart raised his head and thought that it was in vain that he gave that woman to Asel back then. He should have finished with her quietly and not created any unnecessary problems. At that moment, the fox cub rubbed against his leg, as if trying to comfort him or just be close. Eckhart looked at him, and his gaze became softer. He was never so dear to anyone. Running his hand over the fox's ear, he felt the warm softness of the fur, and his mood improved a little. After that, he said that it was time to go to the capital, although the animal did not understand why they needed this. To his silent question, the man replied that they would go to his son. He must help him, since he is still very small and cannot cope with all the difficulties alone. The faithful fox cub quietly followed him, trying to keep up and not make any unnecessary noise. At this time, various rumors about Duke Munrep were circulating in the surrounding area. Even young women discussed it over tea. Everyone was interested. Someone asked if they had heard the latest news, and one woman replied that their family hadn't gone broke yet. The one who started the conversation said that the young head of the family, in collusion with the imperial court, summoned a monster, and apparently it was not possible to subdue it. One of the women noted that she thought so. Others jokingly remarked that it would be funny if he were eaten alive. At this point, another woman intervened in the conversation and said that the news was reaching them too slowly. There was a civil war in the Duchy of Munrepe. All three gasped in surprise. These rumors had not yet reached them. Rumor has it that the monster summoned by Duke Munrep single-handedly fought hundreds of knights and stopped the rebellion. This monster was so ferocious that it burned a lot of knights alive. The women were scared, and one said that if it was such a powerful creature, why wasn't it made a divine beast? Another said it was done to lull Beyonce into a false sense of security. It was said that this monster breathes fire without any magical devices and breaks orichalcum doors with its bare paws. It is capable of breaking through the most powerful barriers without the slightest effort. And he always carries a rabbit with him as an emergency supply. It was scary to even imagine that such a creature could become the new divine beast of the Munrep Duchy. Everyone gasped in unison. One woman wondered where they got this nameless monster to be called a divine beast. Another suggested submitting an official petition to the imperial palace. The third stated that it was impossible for such a terrible creature to be recognized as a divine beast. The maids reported all these conversations to their mistress. She was sitting in the chambers on soft pillows, with the guilty girl kneeling in front of her. The blue-haired princess looked at them with a smirk, and her dull gray-green eyes, wanting to know the whole truth. It was the third princess, Jocasta Lin Aleope, who was deeply interested in this news. She assumed that the monster was truly merciless, otherwise the Duke would not have dared to so rashly reject her marriage proposal. Such behavior was considered unheard of insolence, especially given his position at the time. At that moment, the maid, kneeling and supporting the tea table, felt her body trembling with fatigue. Her strength gave out and the cup slid off her back. The princess looked at her with bewilderment, waiting to see if the girl would be able to cope with the situation. But she gave in, and the princess kicked her. This was followed by a caustic remark that the maid was not even capable of holding a cup for a member of the imperial family. The princess raised her hand. The maids understood that this did not bode well. Everyone knew her fierce disposition. Looking at the maid, she declared that the girl would pay with her life for this oversight. The servants immediately came and seized the poor girl, who begged to be released but to no avail. For not holding the cup, she had to say goodbye to life. The two remaining maids trembled more than ever, fearing that they would now have to play the role of a bedside table. However, the third princess was already thinking about something else. She wanted to see the power of this monster with her own eyes. The girls looked at each other, not knowing what to answer, since they couldn't bring the monster for demonstration either. One of the maids suggested that if they did not answer, they would be executed for disrespecting the princess, and then she had a bright idea. An invitation could be sent to the Duke for Her Highness's upcoming birthday. The idea was well received. The maid exhaled. The sword seemed to hover above her head, but then disappeared. However, the third princess raised her finger again, which did not bode well for the maid. She declared that it was inappropriate for the emperor's daughter to make up a pretext to summon the monster from Munrepe, and then she became even more cruel. Jocasta ordered the execution of the maid for considering the princess weak. The girl screamed, saying that she had committed a mortal sin and asked for forgiveness, but now only one servant remained. She bowed her head and silently shed tears, realizing that she could not even utter a peep, otherwise death was inevitable. The third princess looked at her indifferently and asked what she was so afraid of. The girl didn't know what to answer. She could be killed either for silence or for an incorrect answer. The princess turned away and ordered a letter to be sent to Duke Munrepa with an invitation to her upcoming birthday. It should be emphasized that the Duke may not come, but the divine beast must definitely appear. She really wanted to see him in person and be convinced of his omnipotence. After this decision, Jocasta became cheerful. She loved it when her plans began to come true. One morning, a commotion broke out in the Duke's castle. Even the maids were amazed and could not hide their surprise at the news they heard. The knights stopped fighting only to hear new rumors. At this time, the Duke was holding in his hands a letter sent by the third princess. The grandson drank tea with his grandfather. They had a lot to talk about. Leaving the cup on the table, the grandfather said that despite his youth, the young duke should understand the importance of sending a letter in his own name, and not through a representative. It was a special sign. The lord could not resist suggesting that perhaps his grandson had exchanged love letters with the third princess. Asura was shocked. She could not believe that her husband was in such a relationship with the princess. He told her something about a political marriage, but she didn't think it was that serious. She even imagined them spending time together happily, which made her heart ache. But this did not stop her from eating cookies in large quantities, although it made her think. She thought that her goal, like her mother's, was to marry powerful beasts, and therefore her husband could do the same. However, Evander assured his grandfather that he had never exchanged such letters. Lord LK asked why the princess had sent the invitation in her own name. The grandson suggested that this was probably due to his refusal to enter into a political marriage with the third princess. Grandfather was shocked that Princess Jocasta was really proposing a political marriage, which complicated the situation. No one needed hostility with the imperial palace, and such alliances played a strategic role. However, the grandfather noted that, judging by the letter he had sent, she had not yet given up. Jocasta was the most beautiful of the princesses, but she was also famous for her cruel disposition, her ferocity inspiring fear and respect at the same time. Everyone understood that she was not to be trifled with, and that her plans would have serious consequences, which is why she was rarely invited to balls. Evander looked at her grandfather and said that she hardly wanted to be with him, after which he added that he already had the one he promised to marry, and amazed his grandfather even more. Asura thought that he was speaking too confidently about this, and the grandfather tried to ask who he was talking about. But the grandson answered with restraint that they had not yet signed a contract. He promised to tell her everything when the situation calmed down, but the grandfather said that he would find her himself, and didn't the duke find it outrageous that some impudent woman was demanding a marriage contract? The grandfather still couldn't calm down and repeated that all this was extremely outrageous, and that the girl was generally very outrageous. He believed that marriage should be for love and nothing else. However, Evander said that he did not think so, and confidently added that he considered this marriage to be quite good. He looked at Asura but did not say anything out loud. His gaze was so confident and calm that the grandfather decided not to argue. He wondered who made his grandson look like this. Could it really be the priestess he brought last time? However, if it were her, Dud would have noticed. At that moment, the grandson announced that he was going to go to the capital soon. He still had to report the civil war and announce the appearance of a new divine beast, so he would have to attend the princess's banquet. Grandfather understood that he could not escape this, and he was worried whether this little girl, who was a divine beast, would be able to withstand the onslaught of Jocasta. But, to everyone's surprise, Asura suddenly wanted to meet the princess. From the day she defeated Beyonce, everyone began to bow to her, and she thought that if she began to imitate the princess's cruelty, she would become a truly ferocious dragon. But the duke really didn't want to allow this, because she was very dear to him. However, he could not resist her, and had to accept the inevitable. Asura herself thought that if she could behave like the best of the human race, everyone would finally recognize her. She was so excited about the upcoming trip that she openly expressed her joy. The duke and grandfather couldn't understand why this little girl was so charged with emotion. There were so many people scurrying around, they were literally everywhere. They sold a variety of different fruits. Asura was delighted. She looked around with wide-open eyes and admired everything incredibly. At one point, she became especially excited, shouting that the stones were very beautiful. The duke did not understand what kind of stones she was talking about, but she pointed to a woman adorned with them. Evander thought, well, of course, jewelry, women at any age are women. After which he said that he owed everything to her after winning the Civil War. He thought to himself that they were certainly tight financially, but if she wanted, he could somehow buy her a store in the capital. Evander wanted to do everything in his power for her, so great was his power of gratitude. At that moment, Asura turned around and pointed at some woman and said that she was wearing a gift that her husband had given her. When her grandfather asked what she was talking about, she showed it. The little girl simply unfolded her handkerchief, which the young duke had recently given her. Lord LK turned to his grandson and thought, when did he manage to do that? Here is a meteor. After that, he said that since they had already gone to the capital, he would definitely buy Asura something. Seeing the window of a store, he suggested going in. The most beautiful jewelry that could adorn any woman was on display there. Diamonds, emeralds, and rubies sparkled so much that it was blinding. Some of the decorations were particularly elegant and could not help but attract Asura's attention. Her eyes literally sparkled. She had never seen such luxury. The saleswoman was overjoyed by Asil's delight, who was ready to lick all the display cases. The girl noticed that the Duke's divine beast knew a thing or two about good stones, and offered to try on a few Asil decorated one horn with a ring and put on bracelets and a necklace. She was sure she was very beautiful, but her grandfather remarked that it looked as if it would be easy to lose. After which Selena asked if there was anything smaller. She was told that there wasn't one at the moment, but it could be made to order. At this time, the baby was bathing in jewelry. She loved it madly. She felt like she was rich and the most beautiful in the world, which couldn't help but please a child's heart. Lord LK sighed and said that if she ever lost it, he would buy her a new one. After which he asked if she wanted anything else, and if so, she could say so, but the grandson said that he would pay for it himself. Selena stood behind them and thought, these are really rich people. She knew about their difficult financial situation, like everyone else in the country. However, the grandfather said that the little girl had saved his life, so it was the least he could do, after which he also thought about maybe buying her the whole store. At this time, 2 people entered the room. One of them, the escort, said that he asked to convey his allegiance to Duke Sterapit. It was a priest from the temple who was looking for patrons. But then he saw those whom he had not at all expected to meet. But the unpleasant memories couldn't be erased so easily. Among them was his former novice, who immediately winced and pressed her lips into a cheeky smile. He realized that now he had a chance to win back, and he prepared for it. After which he said that, seeing the night outside, he suddenly realized that Duke Munrepe was inside. Then he turned to them and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The monk noted that they did not have the money to make Selena happy, but it seemed that funds had been found for the pet. The remark sounded rude and inappropriate, so all 3 looked at him with bewilderment. Asil didn't understand at all what they were talking about, but the jewelry suited her very well. Judging by his clothes, he was a low-ranking priest. Looking at him, Evander wondered where he had left his brains to speak so recklessly. At this time, the woman accompanying him asked what he meant and received the answer that he was hinting at the family who had taken the child without showing the slightest sincerity. Selena looked closely at the priest Theodore, who had already been disgusting to her before. The woman asked in surprise if the monk was talking about the Duchy of Munrep. Lord LK grabbed his sword, preparing to punish such liberty, but his grandson stopped him and asked Duchess Sterapit to explain in more detail what had happened. The lord considered this a reasonable proposal and put the sword back into its sheath. The Duchess asked the priest to express his opinion, but he warned that it might be shocking. He stated that the knight standing outside had said that the Duke's pet needed someone to look after it and wanted to entrust it to Selene. He noted that the temple carefully checks a person's abilities before entrusting them with a child. Selena snorted, considering what was said to be complete nonsense. The priest continued, saying that even if Duke Vibrock himself had asked, he could not have broken the temple rules and would have demanded a financial audit for the child's support. However, as Theodore said, the knight simply laughed at him, throwing some kind of fake. Then he loudly declared that he had given him counterfeit coins. Asil began to listen. The priest discovered this too late, when Selena was already in the Duke's castle. He was very angry and harbored a grudge, waiting for the moment to publicly humiliate those who had deceived him. At that moment, Asil, with such a pure and childish look, declared that these were her treasures. Approaching the priest and Duchess Sterapit with a challenge, she said that this was not some kind of trash. The little girl was upset. No one dared to talk like that about her jewelry. They were received in kindergarten for good behavior. Duchess Sterapit realized that since she understood this animal, the magic of translation was at work here. This meant that the baby was in possession of a relic of the imperial family, signifying her status as a divine beast. The Duchess found it impossible that such a small creature could perform such an important role, and Asil sulked. At that moment, Lord Elkai slammed his sword on the floor in an expression of indignation. Duke Evander intervened and asked him to explain how a priest who served a god dared to call the treasures given to him by the divine beast Munrepe trash. Lord Elke realized that his grandson, despite his young age, was capable of resolving issues peacefully and with dignity. However, here Theodore realized that he had missed the mark and made a big mistake. He noticed that Duchess Sterapit, who was accompanying him, turned away, expressing displeasure. The priest began to justify himself and stated that he then thought that it was not a divine beast, but simply the Duke's pet. However, the young Duke firmly stated that the priest was breaking the commandments of the gods with his words. Perhaps the priest despises his divine beast for not inheriting the blood of the previous one. Asura said that if he did not want to use this treasure, he should return it back, to which the priest tried to justify himself. In the end, he admitted that he threw everything away, and this led the little girl to a state of deep grief. She was upset and burst into tears. For her, it was a real treasure that she received in her past life, and it was very valuable. Selena asked how about sending the priest to God's judgment. He realized that he had made more than just a mistake, and, kneeling before those gathered, he said that he would do everything to make amends. He said that he would prepare the same bag as the one they gave him, but with gold, and present it to the Duke. Evander asked what was there. The priest replied that there was a toy gold coin, a broken chess piece, flour, strange fragments. This caused Asura to feel bitterness and resentment. She demanded that this be stopped. Then, feeling helpless, she declared that the new treasures would no longer be her cherished value. At this time, the priest grabbed Duchess Starapit by the hem, hoping for her help. He realized that at this moment he was facing the most serious punishment, perhaps retribution, and decided to turn to the person most inclined to it. Theodore asked for help only this time, groveling and pleading. She pursed her mouth in displeasure, noticing that it was only once. Then she turned to the representatives of the Munrepe family and noted that the priest had already repented enough. Maybe that was enough. And Evander asked if she would have behaved the same way if a divine beast from the Starapit family had been insulted. She asked in surprise if that incident was still tormenting him, since so much time had passed. The young duke stated in a calm tone that there was no statute of limitations for such incidents. At this point, the grandfather asked what they were talking about, and the grandson replied that it didn't matter and that they should continue shopping. Asura was upset. She lost her treasure and could not choose jewelry yet. Her eyes filled with tears, reflected in the precious stones on the display case. On returning home, the Duchess hurried to her husband. She opened the door to his office without warning. And then she said that this concerned the priest they had met today, and demanded that they deal with him. She stated that because of this priest she was put in her place, but no one dares to do such a thing, and Duke Munrep also had his own divine beast. The Duke turned around in bewilderment and asked if Munrepe had really brought up the incident. His wife replied that that was exactly it. It was about the time they used the divine beast to help the Duke destroy the monsters in the desert. Duke Starapit admitted that things had gone a little wrong back then, and half of Munrep's knights had perished in the flames of the feast. But he said that it was all worth it, and that they should be grateful that they were able to save at least the rest. Then Duke Evander said that it was wrong to send the Firebird into the desert, accusing Duke Starapit of imprudence and short-sightedness. Here, Duchess Starapit noticed that she looked closely and saw that Duke Munrep's divine beast was some kind of inconspicuous lizard. She noticed that what she had said about defeating the Beyonte divine beasts was probably a lie. The offended Duchess said that they needed revenge. As revenge, she suggested using their divine beast, Pyra. These weak dukes needed to be put in their place, and she had a very good plan. She suggested burning everything to the ground again to show her strength and power, and then it will be possible to seize the lands of your neighbors and increase your own lands. The next day, the Duke's embassy received some rather unpleasant news. The knights were simply stunned. They did not know what to do. The Starapites began their actions. This was a huge problem for Munrepe and their knights, and they needed the Duke's help to decide what to do. At this time, Asura entered the room and asked what had happened. Dylan began to explain that a request had come from Duke Starapit. They were sent an official letter asking them to hold a friendly duel. The knightly orders of the two duchies were to take part in it. This meant that the knights could not disgrace themselves, otherwise the duchies could lose their good reputation. Asura was surprised. She was simply beautiful today, because she wore the ring that they finally bought her as a bracelet, and was very pleased. However, she said that she didn't see a problem, they just needed to fight. Dylan replied that their skills were significantly inferior to their opponents, and that if they lost, it would bring shame on the name of the Duke and Lady Asura. The little girl said that she was ready to fight for them. She is confident in her strength and wants to demonstrate it. Dylan smiled, saying that they were very grateful, but the divine beast would not be able to participate in a friendly joust. These words upset her very much because she really wanted to help somehow. Then she had an idea and asked everyone to wait. Dylan knew that Asura's ideas could have different consequences and he was very nervous, but she had already set off to settle the matter herself. Her little legs carried her swiftly to the Duke's grandfather's quarters, and she was in a very determined mood, calling him loudly. He asked what had happened, noticing that she hadn't even knocked. At that moment, the little girl noticed that her grandfather was sorting out some of his toys. She couldn't believe that even such big ones also play, and was very surprised. However, she did not focus on this and said that she needed his help. After that, she asked him to follow her. She brought him to the knights, who immediately became embarrassed, not expecting such a guest on the platform. They asked him what business he was there for, and the lord replied that he had heard everything from the little girl on the way. Asura stated that the fastest way to prove one's strength is a fight to the death, so now they must have a duel. The knights had to fight the divine beast Munrepe, who shouted to attack. They were embarrassed, but they had no other choice. They had to agree. At this time, the maid who was sent to the castle was spying and making notes in her head. When she told her about this, her interlocutor was simply delighted. The third princess laughed loudly when she learned that the little lizard was training the knights of Munrepe, and that all sorts of things happen in this life. The maid stood with her head bowed, awaiting further orders. However, the princess decided to ask her in more detail about what was happening. She asked what kind of character the divine beast Munrepe had, and whether he was really as the rumors said. The maid replied that he only hit the knights where it hurt. Princess Jocasta expressed a desire to see this with her own eyes, and noted that Duke Starapit was apparently afraid of Munrepe, which is why he did not engage in duels with the divine beasts. The maid noted that in fact Munrepe had previously been on par with other orders. The princess said that it turned out that they had been underestimated, although perhaps all this time Beyonce had been spoiling public opinion. She stated that the fight promises to be very interesting. After that, she decided that since that was the case, she would go there herself, and ordered that the dukes be contacted so that they would bring their divine beasts to the match. A few days later, 2 days before the friendly duel, the knights thanked Asura for the days spent. They were a little battered, but still brought a gift as a token of their gratitude. The little girl loved the gifts and was absolutely delighted. She was so happy that she broke several training equipment at once. The knights promised to continue training hard and hoped for victory. They realized during these days that they could defeat other orders despite their lack of preparation, and they were delighted with the new opportunities. Asura soaked in the small bath, enjoying the attention and respect she received. Sipping delicious tea, she was confident that the knights would cope after her training. Looking out the window, she noticed that it was already night, and the full moon brightly illuminated everything around. Asura has been living among people for a long time, and just recently she had a birthday. Remembering this, she realized that she had missed her holiday. She couldn't believe she had done this, because this day was very important to her. She thought for a moment and immediately called her friend, the bunny. The little girl decided to throw a small party in honor of her birthday, wearing a homemade cap instead of a party hat. Her guest was supposed to be a bunny, and the piece of cake she took for a snack became a festive treat. She didn't find a candle, but she still tried to rejoice and shouted "Happy birthday, Asura." She repeated this again and again, but nothing could lift her spirits. Asura realized that she was upset, and everything was completely different in her imagination. Turning away from the bunny who was trying to support her, she crawled to the side. The little boy, noticing her sadness, did not know how to help her and suggested continuing the celebration. But Asura realized that all this was not at all what she needed. A real holiday should be fun, with a real cake and friends nearby. In her world, all this was there before, but now she has lost it. Her soul needed support, and she began to cry, remembering how much she missed all of this. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and Asura heard her husband's voice. He asked if he could come in, but she couldn't answer him. There were unshed tears in her throat. The husband stood in front of the door, and then finally decided to come in. In his hand, he held a beautiful box, very elegant and festive. He gently said that it was a gift for her birthday and asked her to accept it. Asura noticed that he had already entered, but she was still slightly sniffling. The husband apologized and said that he was very sorry that he had not given the gift earlier. Asura had an amazing run from tears to joy. The little girl immediately became cheerful when she saw the beautiful box. And when she opened it, she was completely amazed. Her husband remembered that she loved jewelry and decided to make her even more beautiful. The Duke explained that it was a neck ornament that could be worn even over a scarf. Asura was delighted and very happy. She liked this gift. Her husband put it around her neck. It suited her eyes very well. Then she asked her husband to evaluate the jewelry and say if it suited her. She noticed that he had dark circles under his eyes. Did he really not sleep at all? He replied that it was very beautiful, then said that he had heard that she was training the knights for the match. That was his job, but he did not have time and handed her a piece of paper. The Duke was busy preparing a report on the Civil War and added that he had already completed the marriage contract. Asel began to study him carefully. The first point stated that he would never have feelings for the opposite sex, and the second, that he would provide her with everything she asked for. The third one said that for the sake of the Manhwa family, Asel was giving her consent to the adoption of an heir, which left her stupefied. He noticed her look and explained that although the first and second seemed obvious, some people still broke these rules, and that he had drawn up this contract so that she could feel at ease. The little girl understood everything, but it was so sweet of him. Evander said that the third point was that they could not have children of their own, and that they would have to adopt an heir to continue the family line. He hoped that she would agree, even if she didn't really like it. Asel asked why they couldn't have children. In the garden, she was told that if a husband and wife hold hands and sleep together, a child will be born. The Duke pointed out that this was not true, they were of different species and therefore could not have children together. The little girl looked at him with wide-open eyes, and he realized what a child she still was. The Duke was even at a loss, not knowing what to do with it. Then he made the simplest decision. He simply crossed out the third point and said that in any case they would adopt, in any case they could only marry after he reached adulthood. He noted that for now, it is enough for her to look at the first 2 points if she has any doubts about something. The little girl noticed that both points only suited her and asked if he really didn't want anything for himself. In response, she heard that there was only one thing that he really wanted. He wanted her to always be by his side as his divine beast. The little girl was amazed by his loyalty, purity of intentions and devotion, and her heart felt warm. She thought to herself that she would soon return home, but she could not say it now because he looked at her so devotedly. Thanks to the second point, she could put off this conversation to say it later. She reread the contract to make sure she had the right to do so. The Duke saw that she had left her paw print and knew that they were now officially married. He noted that because of his age, they could not become spouses right now, but as soon as he became an adult, he would immediately propose to her. Touched by this, she felt warmth and was glad that her husband was no longer worried. She so wanted him to be happy, she so wanted to make him happy. But then the Duke asked how she celebrated her birthday in her homeland, and she burst into tears again. This question plunged Asel into a sad state. She said that she put on a beautiful festive hat, sang songs, lit candles, and treated herself to cake. The Duke noticed that she had already become very sleepy and stroked her, telling her to go to sleep. He tenderly wished her sweet dreams, looking at her in a way no one had ever looked at him before, then laid his head next to her on the bed and softly called her his companion, trying to get used to this new status. Finally, the day of the friendly match arrived. There were a lot of spectators in the stands. Duke Sterapit really went very far. People were loudly discussing whether he really hoped to publicly humiliate Manhwa, since so many people had gathered. Someone confidently declared that he would win anyway. Manhwa simply had no chance. It was said that after the incident in the desert cave, an entire detachment of the knightly order was replaced. Some noted that a bet on Manhwa would bring good odds, and this news reached Selena. She was determined that she would be the one to win this bet, because recently the Lord had been planning something, constantly asking if she was planning an engagement. Selena replied that there was no talk of marriage, although he still asked many questions during her treatment. He asked if she had caught the eye of anyone in her circle. At that moment, Selena decided that, judging by the book, the third princess had begun to pester the Duke with a political marriage. She assumed that this old man was trying to match her with the main character, and she didn't like that prospect at all. Therefore, she abruptly declared that she intended to remain unmarried because she was against marriage. She said that last night she dreamed of a wedding veil and woke up in tears because she decided she would rather drink poison and die than get married. Just in case, Selena added that she had predicted her fate. She was apparently destined to marry a husband whom she would eat. The Lord noticed that everything was clear, but still felt disappointed. He kept trying to find out who his grandson's bride was. Selena felt that once her defenses were weakened, they would try to attract her to the main character, and she thought that it would not hurt to go abroad. The only thing that was stopping her was money. But this match gave her a chance to win them in a completely legal way. She decided that she would not miss this chance and shouted with all her might for everyone to place their bets. She reminded that if you place a bet on Manhwa, it will increase tenfold, and if you place a bet on Duke Sterapit, it will increase 2 or 3 times. When asked why the difference was so big, she replied that too many people had bet on Sterapit. However, when she suggested placing a bet on Manhwa, they told her that they were not such fools, and there was no point in losing their hard-earned money. This whole situation worked only for her. Her profit could become even greater, and she understood this perfectly well. At that moment, she heard someone bet 3 million gold. She turned around and saw the girl she remembered from the description in the book. The girl said that she was betting 3 million on Munrep's victory. It was immediately clear that she was from a royal family. Princess Jocasta was the one who decided to appear in person at this match. It was impossible not to recognize her by her blue hair, haughty look, and arrogant demeanor. However, Selena still wondered what this princess was doing here, whether she was really so interested in Munrep's victory, although most likely she was confident in their victory. Selena remembered that she had put a spoke in the wheel of the main character before. At least it seemed like she had a strategy, since she was betting such a lot of money. Someone behind my back said that it would be better to give the money away to the poor than to throw it to the wind. But the sharp-tongued princess said that this man probably didn't have a penny behind him. Maybe she should give it to him, as the most destitute. The man got angry and said he was betting 3.5 million gold on Starapit. The stakes began to rise sharply thanks to wounded male pride, rising simply to the sky. They bet on 5 million, and on 4, Selena was in shock. She didn't expect such a surge. But she realized that this was her chance to get rich and leave the country to change her destiny. Money literally flew into her hands thanks to the fact that everyone was confident of Starapit's victory. And all this thanks to the princess and her cunning. Selena mentally wished her luck, because the main character was still in alliance with Asura, which meant she was still in danger of death. At this moment, the host announced the start of a friendly match. He stated that the knights were fighting for their homes and must prove themselves worthy of defending them. Duke Starapit was confident of his victory and expected triumph, and Evander sat quietly, realizing that everything depended on the courage and strength of his warriors. It was a friendly match with best of 3 wins. When the knights entered the field, they knew that a hot and intense battle awaited them. Dylan was the first to step out, his fists clenched, not allowing himself to relax, his gaze full of determination. Opposite him stood a knight named Damon, who immediately tried to ask questions, trying to provoke his opponent into emotion. He asked if he was still afraid of reptiles and called Munrepe losers. Dylan calmly said that he would not give in to provocation and simply told him to pick up the sword. After this, he stated that he would show how much he had changed in Munrep and that he was now stronger than ever. The match went incredibly fast. No one expected anything like that. The presenter declared that it was simply incredible, and the audience was completely delighted by the tension of the situation. Knight Munrepe won the match against his opponent. Everyone in the stands started to get nervous, because everyone believed that the Starapites would score a goal. The scoreboard showed the result of the match. The opponents failed to score a single point. At this moment, Asura sat and was pleased that her honor remained intact. Duke Starapit was sure that Munrepe had bought the judges, otherwise they simply could not lose. After all, they even had a knight who possessed magic. However, Duke Munrepe sat absolutely calmly. He did not show a shadow of emotion. Little Asura was very happy about this. She noticed how his face brightened. She was pleased to see that her husband looked happy. It was important to her so that she could leave him calmly. But Duke Starapit was not going to give up so easily. While drinking wine, he was terribly angry, but did not know how to take revenge. At this point, the crowd became excited. Everyone demanded that the fight continue. Although the presenter announced that the matches were already over, the spectators continued to insist. The presenter tried his best to calm the crowd, and in order to calm them down, he announced the end of the friendly match. But at that moment, Princess Jocasta intervened and demanded that they wait. She came out into public, although she had previously been hiding under a hood. Many were shocked by her appearance. People did not expect that members of the imperial family could be here. The presenter was completely at a loss when she appeared before him. His voice faltered and trembled. Everyone knew about her tough temper. Her beauty was truly undeniable, and it was not for nothing that she was considered to have inherited the best traits of her family. Everyone immediately bowed down, and she stated that when so many people wanted to continue, who was the host to decide when to stop? Asura was amazed. It was the first time she saw that everyone bowed to someone like that. Turning to the right, she saw that even her husband had knelt down, and even that old duke with whom they competed. So, this is the very same infamous third princess. Asura looked at her carefully and suddenly thought how cool she was. She suddenly wanted to become as impressive and strong as the princess. Jocasta said at this time that they could continue, but the difference in power between the orders was too great. Asura did not listen. She now dreamed of universal worship. Looking at the duke who had rejected her, the princess pretended to think about how to change this and achieve equal conditions. After this, she announced that she had come up with and announced her decision. Since there were two divine beasts here at once, in order to strengthen harmony between the houses, she proposed a friendly battle of sacred beasts. It was obvious that she really liked it. She was burning with impatience. The Duke, however, was not happy about this. However, he couldn't say this out loud. Only Asil noticed how his face tensed and anger lit up his eyes. At this time, Duke Starapit said that he refused because such a spontaneous duel was inappropriate. Evander supported him, noting that safety precautions were not observed here, and the battle of divine beasts could lead to disaster. The princess said there was no need to worry. She had called the magicians from the palace to erect a protective barrier. She also agreed that a surprise duel was not the best option, but sometimes fights were not announced in advance. The Duke tried to object when suddenly a new character appeared. He stood firm and confident in front of everyone and declared that he was ready to fight. His master, Duke Starapit, looked at him indignantly. He told him to sit down, but the guy with bright red hair said that it was just a fight and he just needed to act. He felt confident because he had demonstrated his strength more than once. His bright hair and red eyes spoke of a lack of weakness and even a certain cruelty. He asked the Duke if he agreed, because for him it was as easy as pie. All he had to do was defeat the divine beast Munrepe, and it was an easy task for him. At that moment, Duke Starapit pulled him by the leg of his trousers. The divine beast stubbornly pretended not to notice what was happening. Duke Starapit told him to take his place and emphasized that everything was much more complicated than it seemed. But the confident divine beast said he could make the task easier. He shouted out loud for the divine beast Munrepe to come out and fight him, since the crowd demanded it. He called out loudly to his opponent, not imagining what he looked like. At that moment, Asil thought that if she retreated now, Munrepe's honor would be completely destroyed. She remembered that she was the main one among Munrepe, and this could not be forgotten. The Starapit beast continued to shout that if the opponent showed weakness, the entire Munrepe clan would be covered in indelible shame. He loved to get the crowd going. It made their blood boil. At this time, the Duke sighed and realized that there was no escape. He picked up the baby he was about to call his wife, trying to cheer her up. Then he stood up and declared that his divine beast was here, lifting her into his arms. Everyone was just shocked at how small she was. Could it be that this tiny creature, barely visible, some kind of lizard, is the divine beast Munrepe? Everyone was indignant and said that this was some kind of setup. There were rumors that he breathed fire, but his whole appearance raised doubts. He himself looked like rabbit food, as many people noticed. The divine beast Starapit could not believe that this shiny, bald lizard, as he called it out loud, was his rival. It was impossible to address Asil like that. She became furious. She even spat out fire. After that she squealed, and it all looked so cute and unexpected that it became clear that she definitely wouldn't be able to defeat him. But she still shouted furiously at him to attack. She would show him how strong she was. When she entered the arena, the difference in height became so obvious that no one understood why they would arrange a massacre for a child. The divine beast Starapit asked what was wrong with calling a bald head bald, since it was actually bald. Asil got furious and declared that she was not bald at all, she still had a shell. Then he noticed that it wasn't just the remains of hair, but when the shell broke, that's when she would truly become bald. Asil understood that she had nothing to say. She really was bald, but no one dared call her that. However, Pierre still egged her on and noted that the stronger the divine beast, the closer the color of its eyes was to the color of its fur. He laughed and said that Asil had a huge difference. The little girl screamed at him to shut his mouth, and he asked if this was really the monster they were rumoring about. Even those sitting in the stands thought that the fight was unequal. Everyone agreed that all the stories about her victories were simply lies, and Duke Starapit noted with satisfaction that public opinion was changing in his favor. At this point, Selena was biting her nails and didn't know what to do because the fight had already begun, and little Asil just looked and was offended because she was just a child. Selena tried to get Mrs. Asil's attention. She shouted that she knew how to improve hair growth, and strangely enough, the president of the Bald Association turned out to be nearby. He seemed genuinely interested, which was a bit inappropriate at the moment. At that moment, Asil pulled herself together and shouted that the less hair, the stronger the spirit. And she realized that now she could fight, and she had the strength. Inside, she felt that fate had given her a chance again. Everything depended only on her determination. Selena screamed at Asil to hold on, and the president of the Bald Association asked her to reveal the secret. However, Selena had already run away, begging not to be pursued. The divine beast. Starapit looked back at them and thought that he could finish this in no time. He decided it was time to transform. Having launched this process, he felt his strength and power. He beckoned the little lizard with his finger and said that it wouldn't take long. The presenter commented on the situation, noting that the divine beast Munrepe rushed towards the enemy at an insane speed. Asel was indeed running as fast as she could now, feeling furious. Her speed was truly enormous. She put all her anger into it, and she crashed into Duke Starapit's divine beast, after which something unexpected happened. He bounced off like a cork, despite the incredible difference in size between them. Pierre didn't even have time to understand what had happened and indignantly demanded to wait. In fact, he almost lost, almost flying out of the arena before the fight even started. At this point, Selena shook her head in disbelief, wondering what had happened. Starapit grinned, not believing what had happened, and thought how the bald lizard dared to tease him. He then declared that there would be no more concessions, and plumes of flame engulfed the entire arena. It was really impressive. Everyone's mouths just dropped in amazement. The true form of the divine beast appeared in the form of a bird, enveloped in hot flames. She had sharp claws, a beak, and perfect feathers. Everything was on fire. This foreshadowed a bad outcome for the divine beast on the young duke's side. However, the little girl was always interested in things she hadn't seen yet. Asel looked at it, fascinated. The sight was new. The beast rose into the air above her and let out a cry that if the bald one defeated him, he would call her big sister for the rest of his days. However, he then laughed and stated that this would not happen. The duke clenched his fists. It was unfair to Asel since she couldn't fly. He had to make sure she wouldn't give in to provocation. The more heat emanated from the beast on Starapit's side, the more worried the duke became. He remembered how he had burned their nights and couldn't understand how he had allowed it to fight with a little baby. The duke watched what was happening, and his heart sank with pain, but he could not resist the third princess. He rose to his feet, and in his thoughts hoped that Asel would hear the call to run away. However, she stood like a stone statue, as if frozen. The duke shouted to her, trying to attract attention, but in vain. At that moment, a huge ball 30 times larger than her was directed towards her. The commentator immediately stated that the baby probably wouldn't be able to withstand the force of the flames that were unleashed on her. The ball was so huge that Asel simply could not survive it. But why did she just stand there and do nothing? She was just watching. She froze in place. It was impossible to allow her to die so ingloriously. The duke shouted for the match to be stopped and tried to awaken Asel with the power of his mind. Selena prayed with all her heart, hoping to convey her support to her. However, Duke Starapit drank his wine calmly. He did not think that victory would come to him so easily, and this gave him pleasure. Asel stood motionless and watched, while the duke screamed desperately. He demanded that the competition be stopped immediately, as it was unfair. Suddenly, Asel flapped her little dragon wings. She took off from the ground, her speed increasing with each second. Circles began to spin around her, and she began to fly, as if turning into a bird. In the heights, she drew circles, rising higher and higher. Her speed increased with every split second, and she became elusive. At that moment, the presenter noticed this and reported that something had flown upward. And then everyone saw that it was the divine beast Munrepe. She came out of her stupor and prepared for battle. The baby was able to avoid the effects of the fire. Although he was catching up with her with great force, she was faster. All the spectators in the stands were taken aback. No one expected this from the lizard. Even the duke was surprised that she could really fly. However, she trained alone in silence for a long time, but forgot to tell others about it. The duke and Selena breathed a sigh of relief, but immediately became angry that she hadn't shared this earlier. Divine Beast Starapit thought this was getting interesting. However, for him it was just a pathetic trick that could not defeat him. The fire inside it blazed brighter and brighter, and the ball swelled more and more. He directed a stream of fire towards Asel so that she would prepare for the next blow. Finally, she came to her senses. Her shock and numbness had passed, and she was ready to fight. She shouted that one should not underestimate the enemy, and began to fan the purple flames. With each passing second, it grew stronger and stronger, heading towards the fire that the divine beast Starapit was releasing. He didn't loosen his grip. His ball kept growing, and it became increasingly difficult for her to compete. Finally, the two flames met, creating a brilliant confrontation of fire. At this point, the presenter was shouting that this was incredible. The spectacle was truly unthinkable. The divine beast Munrepe, bravely facing the attack, responded with a small fiery breath as the host said. But that wasn't all. The small flame that Asel created turned out to be as sharp as a drill. It cut through the enemy's heart in the midst of a firestorm. The yellow-scarlet flames began to part, Asel putting all her power into breaking through to the divine beast. Inside, Pierre was outraged. He had expected victory to be much easier and faster. It would be strange if this insignificant lizard could defeat him, because he had many battles behind him. He was puzzled as to how the lizard had managed to figure out the weak point of his technique. All the flames she sent burned inside, destroying his fire. He wondered how she dared to resist him, since his strength was unmatched. But the little dragon was much stronger than almost any creature in this world. Her flame was able to defeat the enemy's fire because it was of a different kind. At that moment, his opponent's fireball suddenly flew off, as if it had disappeared, and he was left hanging in the air, discouraged and broken. He had already taken human form again. Asel fluttered with pleasure. Feeling the power of her wings, she felt like a winner. At that moment, the divine beast Starapit's strength left him. He put everything into his fireball, and that was his mistake. He simply fell to the ground, unable to stay in the air. The commentator had seen many fights, but this time he was at a loss and couldn't figure out how to describe what was happening. Selena looked shocked, realizing that it was too early to rejoice. The Duke looked at his little girl, who was to become his wife, feeling relief and joy. At this point, the commentator finally found the words and said that it was incredible. He announced that, contrary to all common sense, the winner was Asil, the divine beast of the Duchy of Monrep. The little one flapped her wings victoriously. She was very pleased. She did a somersault in the air, feeling her wings become stronger and obey her better. And so the host announced that the friendly match was over, and the Duchy of Monrepe had won. The entire arena erupted in applause and cheers, as it was a truly magical and amazing event. But it wasn't just the duchy that had won. One of its inhabitants had now become rich. Selena was swimming in money, not believing that she had her own funds that she could dispose of at her own discretion. At this point, the third princess noticed that all the interesting stuff was over, and considered this a sufficient reason to leave. She gave the order to make sure everything necessary for the battle was completed, and withdrew into the unknown. At this time, Duke Everter turned to Starapit. Looking him firmly in the eyes with clenched fists, he demanded an apology. He demanded that he apologize for his reckless use of the divine beast, which had caused the death of his knights and the insult to their house. The young duke, despite his youth, appeared very firm in his demands, which could not help but inspire respect and discourage the enemy. However, Duke Starapit remained stubbornly silent, not wanting to admit defeat. He thought there was no point in apologizing, but there were too many witnesses around. He finally said the right words, admitting that he had underestimated the power of their house. But inside he thought that this was complete nonsense and he would definitely punish this upstart. He decided to quickly sell the diamond mine, his reward for conquering the desert cave, to restore his honor. If he does this before Monrepe claims it, he will definitely win. At that moment, Starapit heard a familiar voice, in which contempt was noticeable, saying that he was not changing, his conscience had never awakened. The hooded man stated that he had been the same as a child, and the Duke did not expect to meet this particular man. It was Evander's father, Eckhart, golden-haired and stately, but he should have been in the tower. The guest asked his old classmate if he was wrong. The Duke demanded that he come to his castle. However, then he noticed who was at his feet. It was the fox cub, the very one. He shouldn't have been here. Everyone knew that the previous Duke had lost his divine beast. But Eckhart decided to attract the attention of Duke Starapit. He told him not to get distracted. They had unresolved issues. The Duke's initial stupor quickly passed, and he asked how he had managed to get into this castle. He replied that he thought Starapit wasn't so hopeless, since the first thing he did after the fight was head for the safe. However, as he studied what the Duke was doing, he realized that during all this time, he had not become any more noble. He rushed towards the papers, hoping to fleece Evander blind. Starapit remained as insignificant as he had been before. At that moment, loud screams could be heard in the street, coming from behind the castle walls. They shouted that the grain warehouse was burning and that everything was engulfed in flames. Starapit looked at Eckhart and asked if this was his doing. He replied that there was no need to worry. He had checked that there were no people nearby and no one would get hurt. Duke Starapit was furious. This madman Eckhart, whom he had known since the academy, could he really do such a thing? He asked if he shouldn't have been locked up, how did he even get there, and she answered that it was as easy as pie. Eckhart took from the Duke's hands the document with which the royal family had awarded him for pacifying the monsters. He said that there was irrefutable evidence that Duke Starapit was using the divine beast for his own purposes. However, he immediately shouted and said that he should not dare interfere in these matters. After all, even if he has nothing to lose, his son does. Eckhart replied that even if he killed him now, the Monrepa family would not lose anything. As he knows, Eckhart has already lost his title and become a commoner. Duke Starapit looked and could not understand what was wrong with his eyes. With trembling lips, he asked to lower the sword and handed him the papers. At this point, Eckhart said that a little compensation wouldn't hurt because he had been paid for the knight's deaths, but no one had thought about the moral damage. Starapit told him to stop. If he had nothing to lose, his son had, and if he continued in this manner, the moment the ownership passed to Evander, he would make every effort to bring this lizard before the holy tribunal. And Eckhart knew what this meant. Starapit reminded him that the court never shows leniency to those who abuse the power of the sacred beast. Neither property, nor honor, nor dignity, nothing will save him. Does he really want such a fate for his son? After all, he himself appeared before the court, so he should know. Eckhart raised his finger and said that he knew he would say that. He waved to the little fox and he appeared with a paper. She was familiar to Duke Starapit, but he still had doubts. He asked what it was and wondered to himself where he got this document from. It stated that in the event of a civil war, Starapit would provide his divine beast once. Eckhart said he found this in Bianti's house. He has irrefutable evidence that will make Starapit look like a loser. And he asked which of them then had abused the sacred beast. Starapit clenched his fist and said that he agreed. He told Evander to take the documents and get lost. At this time, the fire from the warehouse was already engulfing everything around. And at the Duke of Munrep's estate, lively conversations were taking place. The knights said among themselves that Evander was destined for a heavenly blessing for the difficulties he had to face. They noticed that he behaved with the utmost dignity. Dylan also said that he wouldn't want to go back to the times before Asil. Everyone cheered loudly for Evander and the little baby. She really enjoyed the attention. They thanked her, calling her a divine beast, and said that they eagerly awaited her instructions. She drank the delicious fruit drink, enjoying its refreshing taste, completely satisfied with everything that was happening. However, everyone was so active that she wanted to be in silence for a while. She came out and sat down on a small bench to rest, but at that moment she heard footsteps and a familiar voice. He said she still looked the same, sweet and vulnerable. Her father, whom she had already seen earlier in the forest, approached her. He addressed her as child and told her not to hurry. Asil wondered why Dad was here, why he didn't come to see his son. However, he had something in his hand which he handed to her. It was a small blue box, covered with gold ornamentation. The little girl opened it and saw interesting things. The first thing that caught her eye was the sparkling cat toy that she liked so much. But there was still a pile of papers on which something was written in trembling handwriting. The father turned around and said that the fishing rod was for her and the documents were for his son. She asked if he wouldn't come in. Without turning around, he said that it was not worth it, and she could not say that she saw him. The little girl sat puzzled, wondering if her father never saw her husband. It was very strange because everything in her life was different. However, she could not give orders to an adult who, by all appearances, was quite brave. It was unknown how this could end, so she simply headed back to the castle. On the way, she shouted that she had a gift for her husband. After examining the papers, Evander thought that only one person could have given them. Distracting the little girl from her new toy, he asked if his father had really given it to her. After which he stated that she would not be able to lie to him. The little girl had no choice but to confess. Evander thought about it. After his father destroyed the family, he left. However, before this he made him a duke, placing him as ruler of his family. Evander was left alone and he felt somehow strange and lonely. And he also wanted to hate his father. But now he presented him with an amazing gift, which suddenly made his heart flutter. There must still be some affection left in him for him. Because when he was informed that he had escaped from the abandoned tower, Evander did not give the order for his capture. He decided not to tell anyone about this so that his father could live in peace. Now Evander has turned to his future wife. He asked if she thought he was a bad person. Asil looked at him in surprise, and he said that he just wanted to hate his father. Because of him, a lot of bad things happened in his life. Although he never treated Evander himself badly, Asil realized that her husband was in disarray. She immediately jumped off the couch and ran towards him. The little girl realized that he needed urgent support. Isn't that why she was here? Looking into his eyes, she smiled and said, "After all, he knows everything himself. There is no way her husband can be a villain." Evander looked at her. It seemed that the arguments weren't enough. Then she said that he did a lot of good things for her. First, I found her handkerchief and gave it to her. Then I wished her a happy birthday and gave her that beautiful thing. And he even showed concern for her when he shouted for her to run. The little girl touched his hand and said that she was sure that her husband was not bad. She stroked him again to encourage him further. However, Evander thought that everything was not so simple because he hated his father. Well, that is, he wants to hate, but it is very difficult for him. But he read that it was right, he was sure of it. Therefore, he expected from his future wife complete sincerity, of which only she was capable, and he realized that she said all this from the bottom of her heart, and suddenly his soul ached. He bowed down. Finally, he pulled himself together, looked up at her and said, "Thank you for believing in him, his future wife." Night fell, it was time to sleep. Asle told the bunny how her mother used to say that her father and husband didn't get along. This turned out to be true, but Asle herself got along well with all of her fathers. There was only one thing she felt awkward about. It was a beast-like black dragon. He was quite strange. The flapping of his wings caused clouds to swirl. But he was Asle's biological father. However, she could not remember his name. It began with R. She was told that her name was an echo of his. When the baby hatched, he said he was going on an important business trip and has been gone since. As she was falling asleep, the little girl wondered where her biological father was, and what ultimately happened to him and to those who were the same as her. The next day, the Duke and the little girl had an interesting meeting. The third princess herself visited them. She stated that she had been in a very good mood lately because she had experienced a lot of interesting emotions. In addition, she gained a lot of resources, and thanks to this, she received some secret things that could be used behind the back of her enemy, the Crown Prince. She remarked that she would never have thought that the Duke could be of use to her. He answered with restraint that he was glad that he could help, and she immediately noted the virtues of the divine beast. The little girl tried to copy the princess, who was famous for her cruelty, in everything. Asle thought that thanks to this, she could become a real fierce dragon. Her copying looked quite comical and could not go unnoticed. So the third princess just laughed when she discovered this. She leaned towards her and asked her directly why she was repeating after her. The little girl shook her head, trying to say that it wasn't so, but she was already busted. The princess laughed and said that it was too obvious. After which she stated that she needed to discuss something with the Duke alone, so he asked her to leave for a minute. The Duke stated that the divine beast was one with the head of the house. There was no reason for her to leave. However, the princess reasonably noted that physically there were two of them, and when there were too many ears, you couldn't hear anything good. After which Jocasta declared that if the Duke did not let her go, she would decide that he wanted to marry her and would send another proposal. Evander had no choice but to send Asle outside to have a little fun. She couldn't resist him, so she had to leave. Then the third princess said that she had a question for the Duke, after which she asked him if he loved peace. The Duke did not expect this. He repeated her question and thought about it. She said she had the expression on her face of a person who least of all fits the word peace. The princess laughed and said that such a reaction hurt her a little. It seemed to him that she was trying to flirt. He asked what the motives for this question were. She said that she would tell him everything when he answered. Afterwards, she said that he knew why His Majesty the Emperor had persuaded the Great Temple to ignore the call of his divine beast. The Duke remarked that his existence was incredibly important to the Empire, but Jocasta stated that they could then designate any beast as divine. In fact, the Crown Prince was to blame for everything. The entire Empire knew of his interest in divine beasts. He didn't like that his family didn't have one of their own, and he looked for ways to get one. And the fact that he, Evander, managed to use summoning magic was also the result of his efforts. The Crown Prince was curious about what would happen if a beast without the blessing of the gods became divine in case of failure. He planned to blame Evander and strip him of his title. He didn't understand why she was telling him all this. She said that if he disappeared, his place would be taken by the Crown Prince's protégé. But that wasn't in her plans, so now she's going to share a big secret with him. It's a secret. Even in the Imperial Palace, not everyone knows about it. She looked at the Duke and said that the war would start soon. Her face became serious. He realized that she was not joking. But he was stunned by such a revelation, and the news was not the best. At this time, the little girl was wandering around the corridors of the castle. She was angry with her husband, calling him a rude man in her mind because she didn't want to leave, but he kicked her out. Then she decided that from that day on, she would eat with her feet up on the table, eat all the strawberries alone, and smash doors and walls. At that moment, a man entered the hall, escorting a man. The little girl sensed something strange, and her heart even started beating faster. This aura, she felt that he was pretending. Asle immediately realized that such an aura could not belong to a human. It was an adult beastman. She no longer hoped to meet anyone from her world. But she couldn't be mistaken. It was definitely him. Her heart fluttered in anticipation of the meeting, but he left too quickly. If the imperial palace ruled the empire, then the majestic temple was the place where the divine beasts were controlled. This tradition was maintained for centuries under the guise of communion with the gods. The high priests were located here. There were 4 of them in total. They were the guardians of the heavenly beings who protected the empire. However, now the 2 of them were discussing the unexpected events that had happened recently. One of the high priests clearly showed displeasure. He slammed his fist on the table and said how he could keep his cool in such a situation. An impostor, a despicable upstart, dared to defeat a true divine beast. And even if it was a friendly fight, something like this should not have happened. It shook the heavens themselves. This was the high priest who was previously responsible for and patronized the sacred beast Sterapit. His interlocutor was a priest who had previously been responsible for the sacred beast Munrepe, and who was currently deprived of his heavenly burden. They discussed past events. It was simply unimaginable. Now Munrepe had a divine beast, but no one recognized his divinity, and the second priest found himself in a rather precarious position. The first one said that this was an indelible disgrace to the temple's reputation. The saint had not been in the temple for over a century, and Selena did not want to admit that it was her, so the priest decided to make an offer. He wanted to approach Lord Arcean with a request to conduct an investigation into heresy. This man was appointed to carry out checks to ensure that the divine beasts were not used for harm. The second priest was not at all delighted with this proposal. He knew that the cold-blooded Count Arcean Erzabet was once a holy knight of the temple. He denounced noble houses in order to bring them to trial by the Inquisition. For saving the city, which had almost fallen under the onslaught of monsters several years ago, he was awarded the title of nobility. Lord Erzabet should have conducted a fair investigation to determine whether there were any irregularities. The second priest asked if it was permissible for them to act without telling the other 2. He pointed to the empty chairs where the High Priestess of Sky should have been sitting. The fourth was High Priest Sunrise. The first one said that they could tell them later because the result was important. The impostor needed to be stripped of his title, and they would agree with that. At this time, peaceful events were taking place in the castle. Asel looked at the piece of sky on the ceiling and thought about her own things. She didn't pay attention to what was happening around her, which greatly embarrassed those around her. With her arms spread wide, she was thinking about her own things, and she didn't even pay attention to the gifts presented to her. She remembered that beastman. Who could he have been? But she certainly couldn't be mistaken. She knew that he was from their world. But she didn't feel his presence as strongly as she would have liked, and yet he seemed familiar to her, as if she had met him before. Asel thought that if they met again, she would ask him to take her to the Beastman Forest. At that time, her grandfather called her a little robber. Then he asked if she even listened to her grandfather. The little girl began to come back from her thoughts, although they were so sweet to her, and Lord LK asked if she liked the birthday present he had prepared. Asel said somewhat indifferently that she liked it, noticing that she had simply thought for a second. At that moment, Selena said that she also had a modest gift for her, a special hair tonic, the latest fashion in the capital. Grandfather immediately began to be indignant at me. Why give the tonic to a child? Selena noted that she promised her, because Asel was worried, and how else could she earn the dragon's favor? Grandfather said that Asel's hair would grow back when she grew up. He wanted to take the tonic, but Asel didn't give it to her. He noted that if she started using it now, she would lose even her childhood hair and become completely bald. In any case, as soon as she sheds her shell, she will go bald. The little girl's eyes filled with tears. She buried her face in the blanket, and the Lord asked if Selena had heard that the Inquisitor would be arriving soon. She grabbed her head and was simply in shock because a lot had happened because of him. In the original story, he was the main villain. Arcean pretended to be a devout holy knight and the saint's right hand, but in the end he betrayed her, and she almost died because of him. And for some reason, he also felt a deep hatred for the House of Munrepe, and even cursed the Duke on his deathbed. But another thought came into Selena's head. If a church inquisitor can fabricate a crime, it means that Asel is now in the greatest danger, and only when she is safe will this house prosper. Selena took Asel by the paws and said that she had one request. It would be better if the baby sat in her room for a while. The Inquisitors should not be underestimated. Asel, of course, did not like this, but both adults insisted on their own. Grandfather quite rightly noted that even a black dragon needs to know when to retreat. Asel repeated his words and said that she understood everything, and she honestly decided that she would try very hard. She even promised that she would stay in her room and not go out. But how could she resist when the weather was so beautiful outside? Of course, the child's patience didn't last long. 3 days later, she quietly slipped out of the room because she was bored. She suggested that the bunny play hide and seek to at least have some fun. After counting to 10, she went to look for him. She looked everywhere, but she couldn't find him yet. So running along the corridor, she went very far from her room, and I didn't even notice it at all. But there was no bunny under the carpet either. She ran down the corridor thinking that the bunny had been captured while she was looking for it and fried, and then a sill hit someone's leg with all her might. The man turned around and she saw that it was the one she really wanted to see. Asel was in shock and panic, but inside she felt a flash of joy. It was the same adult beastman she had seen recently. He stopped and looked at her carefully with a firm, cold gaze, after which he said that it looked like she was a black dragon. The little girl was glad that he immediately understood who she was. He asked what she was doing there, noticing that she was a very small, cute child. There was no place for him in the human world. It was unclear how he got here at all. The little girl froze in a stupor for a moment. As it turned out, this was typical for her. So he repeated his question again, noticing to himself that it was a very tiny and charming child. Asel couldn't resist asking if he was really an adult beastman, to which she received an affirmative answer. He asked where her parents were. She said that she didn't have any. She was alone. The beastman asked what she was doing here all alone. She stuck out her little chest and said that she was the boss in Munrep. He was taken aback and asked if she was really a divine beast of this kind. He clenched his fists, because it was for her soul that he came there. After that, he suddenly said that this was not the place for talking. Having uttered some spell, he drew a circle. Holding it in his hands, he then moved it to the floor. They both, along with Asel, found themselves in its center and were suddenly transported to a completely different place. The little girl was simply in shock, and when she saw the coat of arms, her delight knew no bounds. She saw a black lizard on it. It was so nice to see something from a past life. Trying to get her attention, the beastman told her to turn towards him. Then he noticed that for a black dragon she was incredibly small. They even fed her. Asel said that she was always like this, and then asked what kind of animal he was. He folded his hands and said that he was also a black dragon, after which he asked if her irresponsible parents even knew where she was. The little girl said that her mom and dad are not irresponsible. You can't talk about them like that. Lord Erzabet thought to himself that when it came to magic, there was no one better than the black dragons. Yet her parents couldn't even block human summoning magic. He was deeply outraged by this, and Asil tried to protect her parents. He thought they must have looked away from the child for a moment. Apparently they were busy with their own affairs, drinking and partying. Then she was called and she left her world. He couldn't take such magic lightly, because summoning animals through the barrier protecting the forest had to be too powerful. He himself was sent on a reconnaissance mission to the human world, and a seal suddenly came very close to him and touched him. He had to do a thorough investigation now. He couldn't be careless, and the little girl touched his cheek and asked if he could take her home. He felt sorry, but he couldn't help her in any way. There was too little mana in the human world. The little girl was upset, but he said that there are things that even an adult beastman cannot do. She really wanted to go home, but he couldn't help her in any way. Arcian knew he needed to tell his people that human magic had become stronger. Looking at the upset little girl, he crouched down and said that he could protect her and convey the message to the forest that she was okay and safe. Asel looked at him with hope. It was of course not enough, but still pleasant. At the same time, he asked her name. She told him her name. He thought that this was exactly the same name as his daughter, who lived in the forest. She's probably grown up now and can swallow 3 piglets at once. After that, I asked her what her mother's name was. She replied that her name was Brianna. Arzian noted that this was also the name of her ex-wife, and he asked what her biological father's name was then. The baby said she didn't remember. There seemed to be something with an A, but she didn't know for sure. Her mother told her that her name comes from her father's name, but she hadn't seen him for so long that she had completely forgotten about it. Arcian thought indignantly, what kind of father is he if even his own daughter doesn't remember his name? He looked at his notes and thought that there were no other black dragons named Brianna. Arcian thought that maybe it was someone he knew. He was now looking at the names the little girl had given him. And then I remembered that there is only one black dragon whose name begins with A. He told her that her mother's name was the same as his ex-wife's, and her father's name was the same as his. For a sensible adult, he was still rather dull. It finally dawned on him. He suddenly realized that the likelihood was too high that this little girl was his daughter. Looking at the beautiful sun, he thought about what he should do. He has been in this world for too long, and he and his wife are divorced. Arzian hadn't turned on the geomagic communicator he used to communicate with her for several years. Sitting on the tower, he wondered if they would answer him at the other end. There were a lot of doubts, but he was worth trying. Asel was already in the castle and was happily devouring sweets, and her father wondered what had happened then, why he and his wife had separated. It was a small quarrel that started over a trifle and escalated into something serious. They started talking about divorce before he fully realized it, but he couldn't return to the Beastman forest for another 10 years, so they simply divorced. Trying to get an answer, he placed a call on the communicator, wondering if it was the right decision to break up. The magic ball was filling with more and more power. The connection was about to occur. The energy looked like a liquid blot, but it could seep through all protective barriers. And finally, Arzian heard that the connection was established. He decided that he needed to put on a stone face and not show that he still had feelings. He called out to Brianna, stating his name, but she heard a completely different voice, and what he saw was not his wife at all. It was his son, whom he had not seen for so long. Arzian was taken aback, but still asked why he had contacted him. The second communicator remained with his wife. The son replied that his mother told him to throw this thing away. Arzian didn't expect such an answer at all. The son replied that he left it to play. Arzian said that he understood then, after which he asked to call his mother, to which he received the answer that she would not answer now. The father asked what she was doing. The son replied that she had gone to speak with the elders, after which he added that she was talking to them about Asel. She disappeared. The upset son said that adults knew where she was, but they wouldn't tell him. Arzian slapped himself on the forehead and thought, so he was that idiot father who didn't care about his daughter. The boy didn't understand what was being said, but his father said it didn't matter, then added that he shouldn't worry. Asel was here. The son asked where this was. At that moment, the creaking of the door was heard. His mother came in and asked who he was talking to. The son said that his father was calling. Arzian called her name, expecting her to answer him. After which he said that Asil was in the human world. Brianna would not be able to pass through the protective barrier around the forest, since most likely she met with the elders for this. The son asked him again, but at that moment his mother noticed his image. She called him by name, which meant she hadn't forgotten, but she didn't say anything else. Arzian waited to see what would happen next, because he had not heard his ex-wife's voice for so long. He trembled inside, preparing the words he wanted to tell her. However, Brianna walked over and waved her hand over the magic ball. With this, she cut off the connection with the human world. They could no longer speak. Arzian tried to digest the information, everything that had just happened. His daughter was in this world. She is a little dragon who is the head of Munrepe. It was simply mind-boggling. He couldn't believe it. He needed time to digest it all. Meanwhile, unexpected events were taking place in the Imperial Palace. Cries for help were heard from everywhere. Everyone around was demanding water, and the servant who entered the hall with a tray of drinks was simply stunned. Everything was just ablaze. He didn't know what to do. Everyone was rushing to the exit. The servant, who was already delayed with his errand, could not understand what was happening. He asked this question out loud, but no one answered him. Everyone ran, trying to escape the bright flames. And the next day, everyone learned about its consequences from the newspapers. Duke Evander reached for the fresh press in the morning. He read that the Imperial Banquet Hall had been reduced to ashes. Yesterday, the Crown Prince held a reception there to console Duke Starapit, who lost a friendly duel. He was flattered and poured out his soul to the Crown Prince, lamenting the fact that his divine beast had lost. However, Pyr himself drank himself into oblivion. He still couldn't get over his defeat to the bald lizard, and in the end he could no longer control himself. His anger burst out. And along with the anger came clubs of fire, which caused the banquet hall to catch fire. The Duke was unable to stop him in time while talking to the Emperor, and as a result, the inevitable happened. The banquet hall, which was distinguished by its exquisite luxury, was lost forever. It simply burned to the ground. Nothing was left of it. What was worse was that half of the Crown Prince's silver hair, his pride, had also turned to ashes. His Highness was furious and issued a decree banning divine beasts from appearing in the Imperial Palace. The Duke read the article to the end, and Asil was upset. Evander thought that her Princess Jocasta must have been delighted, and the little girl felt sorry. She sighed sadly. Evander asked what was troubling her, and she said that she, too, wanted to attend that glittering banquet. She still wanted to learn a lot from the formidable human princess, but now she would not meet her. She said that there was something good, and the Duke immediately asked what she was talking about. The little girl asked if he remembered the man with black hair, narrow eyes, and a stern look. She was very good at impersonating people, so Evander quickly figured it out. He asked if they were talking about Lord Arcyan. Asel said yes. She stated that she wanted to see him again. Evander was shocked, but on the other hand, since the test was over, he most likely wouldn't come back. However, Asel said that she really wanted to see him. She thought to herself, even if Mr. didn't help her get home, she could still get some news. She wanted to hear what it was like there, in the Beastman forest. After all, she missed everything that was dear to her so much, her heart was fluttering. And here she can find out how her friends are doing. And then she will be able to become a little happier, warmed by their warmth. After all, she spent her last evenings looking longingly out the window. Seeing her expression, Evander became worried and asked if anyone was bullying her. He understood that the question was of course stupid, but just in case. She answered negatively, chuckling, and stated that Asil was a terrible black dragon. Evander said he would write to the Lord and see if it would be possible to meet. I thought to myself that it was difficult to guarantee anything here, but Asil was very happy, and very quickly he received an answer that he did not expect at all. And now they were already in a carriage heading to Lord Arcyan. Duke Evander thought to himself that this was simply incredible. He sent the letter without any hope, but he actually invited Asil, and the Duke himself went to protect her. He watched her tumble around in her seat, happy and content, and he couldn't understand what she was thinking. At this time, Asil had hope that the adult beastmen would tell her all the secrets that happened in her world, and they will even become friends. He will play with her, and finally there will be someone nearby who is of the same kind as she is. Half an hour later, they finally arrived at the palace. Asil was already exhausted with impatience. However, when they entered, they were completely stunned. The little girl could not hold back a loud cry. In a stuttering voice, she asked her husband what it was, but he himself was not ready to answer. It seemed too unreal, and unexpected goosebumps even ran across his body.